Hello, everyone. Glad we are here together. Sorry for the late start. Do we have everyone here?
Is Greg coming?
Let's see. It's like you call magic.
Yeah.
I think we have everyone assembled now. We have Mike and Elizabeth virtually, and then everyone else here in person. Yes, great. And few amendments to the agenda. The data review is going to be different than we discussed. There's been some more time is needed to get the data that we need. Perhaps more resources are going to be needed to get the data that we need. I feel like this is as good a time as anyone who has not heard the wild rumors flying through the education committee that Nicole Lee is leaving the Agency of Education. I'd love to say a very lovely farewell to her at the end of the meeting, but just at this moment, knowing that we're going to need to have a strategy to make sure that we all have the resources that we need to get our work done and support our education system. So we're going to have a different data review than we discussed, but I think the Agency of Education does have something prepared for us, and that will be great. And then we're going to have a really fun whirlwind history of education finance reform, which I think folks have seen in various iterations before, but it's helpful to anchor us in how we got to where we are. We are reviewing a bunch of essentially like policy tools to address cost drivers that came out of that brainstorm that we did together at our last meeting. I am working, Nicole and I did some work in between meetings on organizing that brainstorm. I am trying to turn it into essentially like a Gantt chart, which is like a timeline process map to say which of these would need, like how long would each of these take to implement and or see cost savings, just an estimate as a way of organizing our conversation. And I'd love to share that probably at our next meeting. But in the meantime, we're going to have a tasting menu here on Monday morning of different strategies to address cost drivers, and which were all sort of named in our brainstorm together. On the agenda for community schools, we have Senator Sanders' office, but they are not available. And so instead, we have a great presentation from the Agency of Education about community schools. And I think that is the only change to the only two changes to the agenda. Anyone have any announcements before we hop on in to the meeting minutes? Okay. Has everyone read the meeting minutes thoroughly? Great.
I'm having trouble finding the NL group Wi-Fi. It's not showing up. I have everybody else's. And I tried to put NL group in and it just looked at me like I was crazy.
So, Anne?
Yeah.
See if you can see SOV secure.
Yes, that I saw.
Okay.
SOV guest.
I don't know. We
It says that's a guest on my computer.
Okay. All right.
Yeah, I just have SOV
Yeah.
guest.
Okay, what's the password on that one?
Yeah.
Do
Can't say
you
it
have
out there.
that?
No.
Okay.
I'm signed into.
Okay.
Yeah, you might just be able to access before National Life sent us the update.
Okay.
Yeah. I'll go grab it for you. Oh, Maureen, you got it? That works. Okay.
Okay, if that doesn't work, I can bring my phone closer to your iPad.
I was gonna go ask.
It says it's
Okay.
on.
Craig, we're gonna have witnesses sit there. Sorry, I didn't tell you when you sat down.
Witnesses.
I'm happy.
Or what are they called? People who come share things with us? Experts, guests. Great. Okay.
Feels like interrogation.
That's what we call them. That's what we call them in the legislature. I can move my bag if you want to.
Sure.
Witnesses. Pledge.
Yeah, those are my words that I have to use now. Okay. Voting on the meeting minutes. All in favor of approving them? Aye.
Yes,
Yeah. Anyone opposed? The meeting minutes have passed. Hi, welcome. You can come on in. And with that, we are going to go to public comment. Do we have anyone inside the Teams meeting that is interested in public comment? Okay, thank you. Is anyone here in person interested in public comment? We have no public comment. I don't know the last time that happened. I don't even know what to do. I think we just made up for the lost time for my late arrival.
Is that you covering for my later?
No, I was,
Oh,
no,
okay.
it was not. Okay, then let us jump to the data review.
Okay, great. So I can start with, we've had some conversations on the commission around how to best use the funding that we have allocated, has been appropriated towards the commission. To date, the commission made a decision to bring on a consultant for communications. So the agency has brought on a consultant to support with education finance policy, because I think that's really needed as we move forward with these conversations. So we have brought on New Solutions K-12. And they are helping to support us with some additional analysis and reporting. They will also be, they're also charged to support us with providing training in the field on a variety of topics to promote a better understanding of our education finance system, including kind of education 101, all the way down to the different components of our system and making sense of those elements. So we are, through our Listen and Learn tour, we have been getting input from school board members and education leaders around both the data and the training that would be most impactful so that we can prioritize that as we're rolling out those different resources in the field. So we're excited. In a couple of weeks, we'll be able to have a report that just gives an overview of our education finance system to promote that understanding and how our Vermont education system compares to other states. In terms of the timing in which we do our budgeting, along with how we raise revenue and how we focus on spending. So part of what we thought would be helpful as we're in that process of prioritizing is getting some really concrete recommendations from the finance subcommittee around what type of questions that we want help answering to inform the next steps. So as we're looking at this analysis, we're certainly putting this in the context of our overall education ecosystem. So I think to date, we focused a lot on statewide trends, and we recognize the need, and this committee has recognized as well, to be able to analyze our spending and also our overall outcomes as we look at it in meaningful groups. So in our first state profile report, we looked at it in terms of size by 4 different groups. I know that the chair has asked to look at it by quintiles of spending. And we're also trying to analyze, are there other groupings that make sense as we start to capture the nuance around how we're implementing education in different ways across the state. That type of more nuanced analysis also allows us to identify some exemplars, right, of where things are working really well within our state that could be further scaled and modeled. So we're also within this report clarifying how we count students. And so students are counted in different ways that support programmatic decisions and funding decisions, and being clear around that as we're looking at that. I think this commission has really agreed that as we're entertaining strategies, we need to be thoughtful around how they support education quality, equity, and sustainability. So the programmatic considerations are something else that we're bringing into play. And then also how the money is spent, right, on what type of services. So we've heard a lot from our engagement with the field around the overall spending per pupil doesn't necessarily represent the instructional cost that's spent on students, and being able to define that. I think that's a lot of how this group has been identifying a request for an analysis of the spending by category and function code, and how that could be illustrative as we move forward with really understanding how to make recommendations on a funding system that's equitable. So those are some kind of high level framing around what to anticipate. So with the additional resources we have brought on through the consultant, and looking to get some input from this group around the specific questions that would be helpful to answer so that we can really think about how to prioritize some of that analysis to drive next steps for policymaking. So really wanted to take this time to kind of have that open-ended conversation, making sure that we are developing reports that are also very useful for this committee.
I think from my perspective, and I've said this a few times before, I think we all have assumptions about where the cost drivers are, and I have not seen comprehensive data about those cost drivers. I think I've seen some data about cost drivers on like a statewide basis, but I don't have a sense of how those cost drivers are shaking out in high spending versus low spending districts, mid spending districts. So as we look to figure out how much money we should be spending, how we want to be spending that money, cost effectiveness, whatever sort of cost containment, whatever phrase we want to use, we need to be targeting it to where and how the money might be able to be spent more effectively. And I need to know where the money is spent in order to do that well. And so, and it's more, and I think it's more complicated than, so if we say special ed, for instance, is that extraordinary special ed? Is that special ed that's going into into the education spending line item and is not being tracked that way? Is that special education, intensive special education? Is that is it called tier 2? I like no
Educators in there.
Yeah.
Staff.
So I need to know all of those. And so that's just, so the big buckets are helpful. Student mental health, contracts for mental health, internal staffing for mental health, how much how much that's changed. And again, by districts, because I think looking at it statewide doesn't help us see how a changing lever, like a restriction in that, might impact very, very different districts. Because restricting funding to a low spending district could crash it further than it's crashed already.
Yeah, so we are certainly prioritizing as we look at special education spending. So historically, we've looked at it separately, looking at programmatic and financial. And so what we're doing is we're bringing that together so that we're understanding our overall state of delivering special education in relation also to spending. So we did provide a presentation to our special education directors that gives a sense of how we're delivering special education, how that compares to states of similar size, which is interesting. And then also doing a more granular financial analysis of spending and also related to excess so that you can tease that out. So it's good to hear that that's something you want to see, because that is an area that we've prioritized as really a second report for our consultant to share out. But I think what I think you saying is we need to be clear about the cost drivers and how those are the differentiated impact across the state in different districts.
And sort of another example of those cost drivers, I think we need to be very careful when we address cost drivers that we are not putting in place perverse incentives to just move that money out of, say, above the line education fund dollar into district spending, which is what, other states might do because it's not one big fund, right? But if we're just moving things between districts and the statewide education, like above the line on the ed fund, that doesn't actually reduce spending at all. It just moves things around, so it's harder for us to track.
So you mentioned special ed. What are the other big cost drivers that the committee is looking to understand?
Mental health.
We're trying to understand that too.
Well, the association has talked about personnel, facilities, tuition payments, and I think mental health services for big buckets that we've talked about quite a
Health
bit.
insurance.
I think all of those, though, are all assumptions that we have all gathered up from our own experiences and our own analysis. And what I think there might be cost drivers that we don't know about yet that are sort of, able to be masked. Or maybe some of those things aren't actually cost drivers and we all just think they are. I don't know.
I'm not clear what's happening with PCBs now that is that a is at a cost that is not being picked up by the state once the money runs out, and then, but there's impacts being picked up at the local level. I'm not clear at all how that program's working right now. Or not,
Yeah.
in terms of the cost shift. So I appreciate the thoughtful approach, and I'm struggling a little bit with how it jives with some of the messaging I've heard as part of the gubernatorial campaign. So, and maybe other legislative races where the sort of message is this commission process is going to take too long and probably not result in anything meaningful. And so I'm just trying to sort of reconcile like the need for a deliberative, thoughtful, well-informed process with you better have something ready for this legislative session because we cannot possibly sustain the situation that we're in. And like, what is it? What are we here to do? Because I can totally get behind thoughtful analysis and understanding the impacts on equity and quality. I think that is something we should be doing, but from a political perspective, that doesn't seem like where folks are at. And so what I don't want to have happen is this process takes a thoughtful approach and but there's a parallel process that's happening that's designed to impact budgets in the coming session. And we're not ready for that.
And I can tell you, the superintendent's already preparing for that. We had a meeting last week, a joint meeting with our finance directors across the state. So we feel the pressure. I can just tell you from looking at my own budget that the costs are up again. So I think I'm speaking for all of my colleagues when I say we understand the challenges and we understand the fact that we need to find areas to reduce. But we also have a lot of anxiety going into a next legislative session, knowing that there needs to be some short-term solutions put on the table.
I would like to broadly acknowledge just on my own behalf, like just from my own voice, but that this is not something that any one district can go at alone. And I still feel hopeful that every district can be sort of mindful of the whole in a way that they are not accustomed to being, right? What I'm hoping that today can sort of set us up for is to continue to differentiate between short-term solutions, medium-term solutions, and long-term solutions. I think that sort of Gantt chart will help with that. I think having this sampler of understanding what some of the cost drivers are and what solutions could look like for those cost drivers will help. I know that the full commission that you all are all on, and I am not, is meeting to sort of hear preliminary findings from this group next week. Is that next week?
21st.
And I'm going to somewhat absurdly come and sit in front of all of you and tell you about the work we've been doing. And so I'm hoping that as we sort of move through this meeting, we can find out what a best path for that would be. It's not going to be findings. It's going to be like a process update, as you can imagine. But I agree that if there is not something clear that comes out of this group and the commission by January, then the political pressure, even outside of what the administration might bring to the table, I think with what every legislator is hearing in their district, we're just going to have like 100 different bills with different little bits of things, and no one able to look at the whole. And it's our responsibility here to look at the whole.
We're all being asked forums and by the press, what is your solution to the property tax?
In 50 words or less.
I got 250 to tell them that if I had the solution, I'd be running for president or at least governor. It took us a lot of years to get here, and we're not going to get out in 1 year. The challenge, and I've said this since the beginning, is to find something we can do to tread water this year, either in revenue or, some cutbacks in something to get us through without doing harm. And that just getting through without doing harm, it's already becoming very politicized out there. And that makes it difficult.
And I think politics aside, there's already been a lot of harm done. I know some
Yes.
like, brilliant career educators that have left in the last year because of how disheartening the budget process has been. I know, people who can't pay their property taxes.
People see
Yeah.
people losing their houses. People see rent going up more.
And all of those things, hurt kids, right? And despite all of the political rhetoric of the fact that we've studied this to death, there's so much we don't know. We will be, the legislature commissioned an update to the Pikers report in the spring. JFO did, and that's going to be released probably sometime this week from JFO. And that will give us more information, but it's, none of this is a roadmap. There's still massive policy decisions to be made from everything. So,
Those are two.
hi, Elizabeth. Sorry about hybrid.
That's
Go ahead.
okay. Sorry, I couldn't make it to this one. I have a double booked meeting this afternoon. So I'm gonna have to be out of this meeting by like 12:50, I think. I'm gonna
Okay.
have to leave. But I just wanted to kind of add into something that Mike was talking about with the meeting we just had with all the superintendents and the business managers for many of the districts that were there. They did a tabletop exercise at that, and it was an activity where they, very similar to our Jam board, only in person, and basically putting ideas and thoughts about short-term, long-term barriers, cost containment, all of those topics on sheets of paper, and then taking stickies and highlighting the ones that were the most popular part of those conversations. It was very interesting to see that many of the same topics that came up on our Jam board are identical to what came up on all of those with a slightly different group of people, right? And then also the items that seemed most popular and most conversational or comfortable for that group, the ones with the most little dots of stickies on them, were also some of the top conversations that we had in that Jam board. So I don't know if there's any thought about trying to collaborate that activity with our Jam board as we move forward with that conversation.
Are there notes from that are comprehensible rather than pictures of flip charts?
There are notes and we're putting them together, so we hope to have
Okay.
some information very soon.
Yeah. Would love to put those two pieces together. That would be incredible. Yeah. Let's go back to Elizabeth, is it helpful for you if we all sign in as politely as Mike did?
It's great because then I can see you, but I can hear you all fine. So whatever's easiest, it's fine. You guys are fine.
Okay, I'm gonna take a minute to do that myself because I would want it if I were you and if other folks. No computer, Craig?
No.
Wow, bold.
So I think the kind of initial framing that I set up was to what I call set the table, right? Making sure that we're understanding our education ecosystem and all the components of that. What I'm also hearing is there is a sense of urgency and there's a balance that we have to place on that. So as we think about specific cost containment strategies, think being able to be clear around what are those cost containment strategies that would be most viable and impactful for this session, right? And make we're clear on that because that can also inform the analysis to understand, to what degree we would establish benchmark recommendations.
All right, that's me, sorry. Got it.
Me,
No, you're good.
No, it's me. I muted myself. Sorry.
thought I had all the volume turned down.
And so I don't think we can decide how to prioritize whether or not things are available for the short and long term until we actually understand what the cost drivers are. And so I'm curious about what timing might feel like to really be able to have that data available for us.
I appreciate some of the work the secretary is doing with her Listen and Learn tour. We talked a lot about cost drivers and the role of mental health. To tease that out is very challenging
Mhm.
with the chart of accounts and there have been a number of breakout sessions. I was at the very first one, so I'm not sure how the others have gone, but really talking with the people in the field, special education directors, finance directors about where they are categorized, because we don't know. We feel that that's a cost driver, but we really don't have the data to really analyze that at this point.
It is a challenge. So that has been a dedicated breakout session at every regional planning. And we brought forward, here's how we think we might be able to estimate, quantify that amount. But to Mike's point, it's being coded so differently across the state that it is really hard to have a true number. However, I think we can continue to make strides in saying this is an approximate. That continues to become a challenge when you think about resources. So there's a difference between saying we need more analytical resources and we need different data. Some data we don't have visibility to at the state level, right? And that's where we're working with the field to have more granularity and the type of information we collect so that we can do that in a uniform way. But there are going to be this cycle areas where the school districts may not give the state certain information right now. And that's something that we'll need to be able to call out as we go forward. And mental health is a great example because it's coded very differently across districts.
Well, and sometimes it's in-house and sometimes it's contracted services and, and I think we have to, in all of this, be just mindful of capacity, timing, and to what end, and so for me, one of the promising pieces around looking into how we're spending our money on mental health supports and other human services type is to what extent are we as a state not taking advantage of Medicaid funding to offset the costs?
That's actually on our agenda for later.
So, if it's more sort of like, what money are we leaving on the table because we're spending it this way as opposed to a different way?
right.
That to me would be leading us to maybe something concrete, right? As opposed to, how do you characterize the service versus how you, I don't know. I think giving districts some clarity around if you provide this service currently, how do you pay for it? I know at the Winooski School District, we bill Medicaid for a fair amount of services. I don't know whether all districts do that, if they know how to do that, or so just sort of tailoring the data to a policy change that we
Exactly.
might be able to.
Right.
And we do as well. It does take a lot of cost and time of a person, and that
Yes.
could be a scalable type of activity that could also produce some cost savings.
Medicaid billing.
Yes,
Yeah.
because we're at the point where the benefit doesn't necessarily offset the cost. And that's one of the challenges I think a lot of places that bill for Medicaid face.
And so cost effectiveness in that realm can mean, our districts fully drawing down Medicaid funds with different capacities they might or might not. Are we duplicating those resources between designated agencies and districts? Is there another level of administration where that billing and the drawing down of funds could happen, right? Like so
Correct.
many questions,
Is
and
the
that's, we
scale
don't know
is
that.
a question, right? Because
Yeah.
what you're describing is the cost of staffing versus the actual
Mhm.
amount that can be billed.
Mm-hmm.
And I don't think we'll know the answer to any of those questions until we can even see just where mental health dollars are being spent and how much mental health dollars are being drawn down.
But I think what we have heard is through all of our Listen and Learn tour is scale is always an important consideration as we're thinking about this and evaluating cost effectiveness and the maximizing of all dollars available, right? I think how do we braid funds effectively?
And I think a big concern about, and we're going to talk about BOCES later, but I think even a big concern about sort of like regional governance, which is a theme more broadly beyond this, is are we adding just another layer of administration on top of the existing layer of administration, or are we actually adding an effective layer of administration that could reduce burden on other layers? Anything else on data? Do you have a timeline sense?
Yeah, so for our first report, we are looking within a couple weeks to be able to share that out. And that is really being able to provide an overview of Vermont's education system and how it compares to other states. I think that'll help us to understand how we start to analyze these more refined policy questions.
And is it looking at just how we're spending money compared to other states, or is it sort of how, I mean, if the associations and their comment also raised this question of reliance on the property tax, Vermont compared to other states, like are there other, so is it looking at
Right.
that piece too?
Absolutely. We're very unique with how we do
We sure are.
education,
Yes.
financing. And it's great if that uniqueness really results in better outcomes, but if it doesn't, then we need to think about what are other practical models that could be implemented in our state that would work.
And do you have a sense of timing on the sort of more refined questions?
We'll come back on that.
Okay. And if we need to bring more resources to bear on the issue, what would be the process? Does the commission as a whole or the steering committee need to be requesting that?
Yeah, so the commission decided not to hire an education finance policy consultant, which is why the agency did, because I felt like we really did need that. So there's a pot of money that's been appropriated for the commission. Right now, the prioritization has been on a focus on communications. When the commission gets to the point of actually defining what budget will be allocated towards that, I think there's conversation around what room the commission may want to include for additional expertise beyond public engagement.
So the commission could change their mind.
They could.
Okay. And is that the full commission or the steering committee that does that? So it's on the steering
Steering
committee.
committee makes
Most of you on the-
recommendations, but the full commission makes decisions. The
Okay.
steering committee can't.
And alternatively, I mean, we have a resource in place that we're working with the field to prioritize that, right? So that's just a resource also available through the agency.
It's possible that the scope of work could be expanded with the existing mission
And we can
budget. Okay.
When does the steering committee meet again?
Canceled, wasn't it?
Next Monday.
Yeah, it
right?
was gonna be next Monday, but now it's unscheduled, I think.
So I don't
Cool,
know,
okay.
maybe more emails.
We'll figure that
I
out.
think it's supposed to be the third Monday of the month. And
Yeah.
because we moved the full commission meeting to the third Monday, it didn't make sense to have both meetings on that same day.
That makes sense. Okay. Does anyone have anything else on data? Okay. Let's take a brief break. So those of us who rushed in late can have a moment to settle ourselves. And then we can figure out how we're going to shuffle the agenda around given the space gap here we have. Do we still record during our break? Can we pause the recording? I realized I didn't make a plan for eating for people. Do we want to?
Peanut butter and jelly sandwich.
I packed some food. I don't know if everyone packed food.
She brought
I
snacks.
know.
She's like
Nicole
ready to
brought
pop up.
I'm just wondering, like, do people need to order in? Are people okay to not eat till 1:30? When do we want to do that?
Okay, pushing through.
I am too. That's
Okay,
what I was
cool.
anticipating. Plus, we're ahead of the game now.
Yes, great. Okay, cool.
Do you want us to ping the attorneys?
That
who
would be
are
really
next?
nice.
Okay. Are you pinging?
So we are going to restart with education finance history in a few minutes, but our attorneys are on their way here. And so it will be probably another like 10 minutes until we get started again. Thank you so much for being here. Abby, are you the keeper of the presentation?
Good morning. Yes, I'm here and I can share my screen if you would like, or are you all following along?
We are not following along. Some people
Okay.
didn't even bring a computer with them today.
Sounds like a personal attack.
Yeah. Note to self. I would not do that to you. Yeah, I know.
I'm on.
I know. I
Wow.
know you were
Piling on.
So if you could share your screen, that would be great, Abby. Thank you.
Great. And I apologize. I'm going to just have to leave my camera off. I have some strange things that happen with my laptop when I'm working from home. So I will be here. You'll just have a sort of disembodied voice. And I will go ahead and share my screen. Okay.
It's working.
Yep, we're good.
And are we recording again?
Yes.
Cool. Thanks.
Okay. Just going to pause for a moment. I can't, is everyone able to see and hear when I share? It sort of
Yeah,
cut
we
out
can. Thank you.
momentarily. Okay, great. I'm sorry. I hope that doesn't happen again. Okay, so I'm going to present on the history of education and finance reform in Vermont. And a really quick disclaimer, I am not sort of the most expert of people to be presenting on this, but I have some experience in education law as regards tax policy and law. I know Emily Simmons is also on the call if you have any more education related questions, and I invite her to just pipe up and jump in. I can't actually see everyone. So please feel free to interrupt me if you have anything to add or correct. So my title is Executive Policy Advisor at the Department of Taxes. I have been working in tax law more generally for about 9 years now, and many of you do know me as legislative counsel in my previous role. That's where I really interacted the most with the foundation formula, Brigham, and the sort of more, like I said, the more tax aspects of education finance. So to jump right in, this is sort of my outline, and I will try and keep it brief. There are some topics we could really dive very deeply into, so please just let me know if there's anything you're more or less interested in. I'll try not to talk too much. I was hoping to save questions for the end, but whatever works best for you, whatever format is your preference. I also do want to give credit to former and present legislative counsel. I took a lot of my presentation from presentations that have been given over the years about Brigham in particular. So thank you to Peter Griffin and JFO, Jim Desmarais, and Beth St. James, all of whose work is sort of folded into this. And if you're interested, I can provide links to those presentations. It's a lot of the same information, just sort of repackaged here. So to start, I'm just going to dive right into the foundation formula. So what was in effect before 1998? The property tax and school funding system in Vermont was really different from what we have today. Although in combing back through the historical statutes, I did find a lot of similarities. Some things I wasn't aware were in statute before. So it's really interesting to go back and see what has been built on, but then what, really fundamentally was changed after 1998. So back before 1998, before Act 60, there were still two main funding sources, but they were very different from today. So the first was town property taxes, and the second was the state foundation aid, and they were very interlinked. There was, of course, federal funding, but we're really focusing on how Vermont raised education funding. Towns voted on their education spending, so like today. However, they only raised their education funding through the property tax. The way that that was calculated was that the state would determine an amount. It was called the foundation aid or foundation plan amount. And that was the cost that the state determined would provide a minimum quality education. The state would then set a base property tax rate that was intended to be a reasonable rate that would raise the foundation amount. If a town was unable to raise that amount from its grand list using that base property tax rate, the state would then pay the difference, but only up to that foundation amount that was meant to be enough to provide a minimum quality education. So what happened and what the basis of the Brigham challenge and lawsuit was that if a town wanted to spend more than that foundation amount, it had to be raised through its own property tax. So you have a little visual here showing an example town that if they were just trying to raise the foundation amount, which in this example is $5,000, and the state had set the base tax rate at 1%, and we're doing a fictional, town-wide grand list of $400,000, then the amount raised by the town would only be $4,000. The state would make up that $1,000 to get them to the foundation amount, the foundation grant. So the town would not have to raise anything additional beyond that 1%. So their tax rate would be 1%.
Abby, can I ask you a question about that?
Sure. I'll go back to
And
that.
I'm sort of surprised. I've never wondered this before, so I'm excited for your presentation. Thank you for being here. The setting of the tax rate by the legislature every year, did that happen on the same sort of wild timeline that we do it now? And it's totally understandable if you don't know the answer to this.
I do not know. I would presume it was a similar process, but I do not know. I could go back through and look at statute at the time, but I certainly wasn't working at that
Do you
time.
remember, Anne?
No, it
Oh,
was
okay.
even before my time.
Okay.
But the thing that struck me is the word minimum education. The lawsuits, as I understand it, in the rest of the country have been over adequate.
Well, don't jump ahead. We're going to get to
Yeah.
Brigham any second.
But it's the word minimum that to me sticks out.
Yes, and I can go back
I asked
through.
because I think one of the sources of instability right now is this like ever-changing tax rate at this very difficult time of year that it's set. So anyway, back to you, Abby. Thanks.
Sure, certainly. And I can go back through and confirm. I'm not sure I can flip through without stopping the screen share, but I believe the minimum quality education was in statute. But I can go back and confirm that. Where we see the sort of inequity that was an issue in Brigham is in the example comparing two towns. So you see that giant red block is the amount that the town had to raise above the foundation formula. So if you have two towns that both want to spend $10,000 and the foundation amount is $5,000, that base rate is still 1%. Depending on the town's grand list, the tax rate and the amount raised above the foundation amount is wildly divergent. So you see for town A, again, they have a $400,000 grand list. They can only raise $4,000 at a 1% state base rate, tax rate. The state will give them $1,000 to reach the $5,000 foundation amount, but in order to have a $10,000 spending amount, that town has to raise another $5,000 on their grand list, which brings their tax rate up to 2.25%. Compared to town B, where they have a much more sizable grand list. In this example, again, totally fictional, $1 million grand list, they're able to raise the full $10,000 that they want to spend just using the state base rate. Okay, so we're moving on to Brigham. This is really just a general, I'm going to dive much more deeply into the holdings and the constitutional concerns and what the Supreme Court actually said in Brigham. But just generally, this is quite a narrow decision about the constitutionality of the education financing mechanism. And it says at the bottom, there hasn't been any other court cases that have overruled this as precedent. So it is still good jurisprudence. There's no new interpretation. There have been, I was able to find several cases that have brought up similar challenges. Right after Act 60 was passed, there were two cases, Anderson v. State and Stowe Citizens for Responsible Government. They both challenged really the Act 60 response to Brigham, but neither were successful. They were both considered premature. They were also claiming that it was discriminatory, and neither case succeeded. More recently, in 2022, there was the case Boyd v. State, also challenging the education funding mechanism, but it was not found to violate Brigham or the Constitution, and Brigham, again, has not been overturned in any way. So I'm not going to go really in detail into the facts, but I think it is important just to remember each time I read Brigham, it's a good reminder that there were 3 sets of plaintiffs. There were students, property owners, and there were school districts who all brought this claim. They each had slightly different claims and facts, but the predominant claim was that the education finance system under the foundation formula did violate the Vermont Constitution. So the actual holdings, and I apologize, I ran out of nice graphics once I got into the court case. Couldn't quite think of anything else that was pretty to put in here. So it's a lot of words. The main holding is that the education financing system at the time, so the foundation formula, which was dependent on local property taxes, resulted in wide disparities in revenues available to local school districts, and that it deprived children of an equal educational opportunity, and that violated the Education Clause and the Common Benefits Clause under the Vermont Constitution. And again, these are probably quotes that you've heard or seen, but I thought they were really important to emphasize here, that the constitutional obligation that the state has is to ensure substantial equality of educational opportunity in Vermont. It's I thought it was notable how many italicized parts of the decision there were. I think there was no absolute equality requirement. I thought that was notable. So just to point that out, it's substantial equality, not absolute. And then although the legislature should act, so this was the Supreme Court requesting that the legislature take action to make educational opportunity available on substantially equal terms, the court was very clear that the actual means and mechanism of providing substantially equal access to educational opportunity in Vermont is not, there's no requirement within the Constitution for any particular form of funding education. And they also pointed out that local control is not required under the Constitution. So those are up to the discretion of the legislature to determine.
And for anyone who has not read the Brigham decision, I am not a person who really enjoys reading statute or is particularly good at it, and is very it is a very lovely and readable document for anyone in our studio audience that wants to do that this evening.
And I would be happy to send a copy of Brigham. I tried to find one that was online, and there wasn't an easy way to find the 1997 decision. So I'd be happy to share that with the commission or subcommittee. Absolutely. And here, I did provide the link. So whenever you see the headers highlighted, I've provided links that are publicly available. So the Vermont Constitution is cited here. First, the Education Clause requires that a competent number of schools be maintained in each town, unless otherwise permitted by the legislature, for the convenient instruction of youth. And the Common Benefits Clause is that government is or ought to be instituted for the common benefit, protection, and security of the people, and not for the particular emolument or advantage of a single person, family, or set of persons who are part only of that community. So the Supreme Court went on in Brigham to interpret both of those and to apply them in the case that was brought before them. There is only one, they really emphasize that only one governmental service, public education, has ever been accorded constitutional status in Vermont. They also provided a really nice sort of historical background on the Education Clause. They made it clear there's no such right in the U.S. Constitution, and very few other states have a constitutional right to education. The form of the Education Clause has been in the Vermont Constitution since the beginning. It was changed slightly. It has been changed slightly over the years, but it has been more or less in place since 1777. It does require that a school be maintained in each town unless the legislature permits otherwise. But again, it is silent on the means of school support or funding. And I did note this emphasis is in the original that our Constitution nowhere states that revenue for education must be raised locally or that the source of the revenue must be property taxes. So those are important points to keep in mind. These are legislative prerogatives. And also that the education clause does state that the state is responsible to provide for education, but is silent on the means to carry it out. So these are really just emphasizing that the legislature can decide how to fund the actual mechanism for funding education in Vermont. I tried not to put too many tests in here. The court did point out that the Common Benefits Clause is generally coextensive, so a similar test to the U.S. Equal Protection Clause, and the state must demonstrate that any discrimination occasioned by the law serves a compelling governmental interest and is narrowly tailored to serve that objective. The court started to go into a rational basis test, but did not go deeply into that. It instead sort of took a step back and said, no, we're simply unable to fathom a legitimate governmental purpose to justify the inequities and educational opportunities based on the facts. And again, emphasized that the distribution of a resource is precious as an educational opportunity may not have as its determining force the mere fortuity of a child's residence. It requires no particular constitutional expertise to recognize the capriciousness of such a system. So it didn't go deeply into whether the Common Benefits Clause requires a rational basis test. It just said, no, we are saying clearly this is an unconstitutional system. So I'm going to pause there if there are any questions, because I'm going to dive into legislative action next. And I know you were mentioning some questions about minimum versus adequate. I had not gone into depth into that sort of analysis. That wasn't, I don't think Brigham really touched deeply on those particular terms.
And I don't know if I was explicit about this. The reason I added this to the agenda is that people regularly use Brigham as a guardrail, and everyone has their own version of what Brigham means. And so I think it's helpful for us all to have at least one shared story of what Brigham means. And then two, sort of like further on as we get into more additions and subtractions to education finance law, to realize that a lot of this has been, I think we've been attempting some of what we're attempting this year many times before, and had mixed results. And so I think it's helpful to learn from that as well. Anne, did you want to ask more about this question of minimum versus adequate? About minimum versus adequate, you brought it up earlier, and Abby was wondering if you wanted to know more about it.
Well, because most other states, the state determines what is an adequate amount. And I remember testimony back then, and I wasn't on the committee when Act 60 got written. Senator McDonald is my muse. I think he has it memorized. But because it's local control, local voters determine what is adequate or what they want to spend. And the state raises that. Other states, the state determines what is adequate. And most of the lawsuits and findings have been around what is adequacy. I think, was it Idaho? There was just a lawsuit this year about underfunding. It was Idaho, Wyoming. They've been fairly regular. But when we had the original PICUS look at this decision, I think it was 2015, said that our system did what we wanted. It maintained local control, and it did Brigham. It met Brigham. But it's all the local control is another lever in here that is very different in Vermont as to
It is not required by the Constitution.
it is
No.
I think I've studied education, finance litigation. So there are two general types of constitutional provisions, is my understanding. One is adequacy. So state will provide adequate education. And so there's been a lot of litigation around what constitutes adequacy in those states. And I think Vermont is one of, I don't know that we're the only one, but one of very few that has an equal access to educational opportunities. So our analysis, I think, from a constitutional perspective is a little different. I don't think they're necessarily inconsistent, but that's why I think there's been a lot more litigation on what constitutes adequacy, because that's the language in the
And
Constitution.
adequate might be in the eyes of the beholder.
Yeah,
And my understanding is that when Brigham happened, there were lawsuits like this all over the country,
Yes.
and it was because the particular shape of our constitution that we wound up with the decision we did.
yes.
So I was thinking it might be helpful at our next meeting to do a little bit more of like a national look at how some of this looks in other states. Would that be helpful to folks? I know you
That's
brought it
the
up
report.
earlier.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
the report that we've commissioned first, so
Okay.
that we can have that comparison. And we may be the only state that does it this way. Other states establish what that amount will be and set that early on in the budgeting cycle, whereas in Vermont, it's the local communities that are setting that rate. So what's happening is, I mean, as an outcome, we're seeing that there is inequity, right, in terms of how funding is invested statewide.
The tax rate impact is the same, but the decision in terms of
Yeah.
how the, what the level of investment is
Mhm.
still.
Right.
And I'm curious, if there was another lawsuit now that came out of some of our, deeply low spending districts, if perhaps, we're not meeting our constitutional requirements
know.
anymore in that way.
When we were doing Act 46, we were given the caution that because for wealthier communities, it is easier to pay for an increase of a penny on the tax rate than it is in poorer communities. There was the potential of another inadequacy lawsuit that as that amount that gets spent per student starts to spread, that we needed to be aware and to watch that.
Let's go back to the presentation.
Like Emily has her hand up.
Oh, thank you.
So, 2 points that I would add just to maybe enrich the discussion. One, I would not have us focus on terminology like adequate versus minimum so much as making sure to understand the different funding models and how they raise and distribute revenue, because there is no magic necessarily in any of these labels, and different states might use them in different ways. And also, I think there was a trend at one moment to use the term adequacy to label different or similar funding formulas, and we all know trends come and go, so they might not have the same meaning today that they did at the time they were adopted. And also, to Senator Cummings' point, we had a challenge. Abby mentioned it, Boyd v. State. In recent memory, I believe that was in 2018, and that case was dismissed as against the state. So the state prevailed in defending the particulars of the then current funding formula and mechanisms. Of course, we tend to tweak the formula a little bit through legislation. So can't promise that you would get exactly the same result with the same claim today. But I just wanted to point out, as Abby mentioned, the courts have reviewed our more current funding system in light of an inequity challenge. The plaintiffs sometimes characterize that case as the new Brigham, and that ultimately was not successful, and the system was upheld as constitutional.
When was that, Emily?
That was filed in 2018.
Was that from Whitingham?
Yes.
Okay,
What?
thank you.
The town, yeah, the plaintiff names changed a little bit, but yeah, that is the case you're thinking of, Emily.
Okay, thanks. Abby, the mic's yours.
Okay, thank you. So I will move on now to legislative action, and again, apologize for how wordy this is. It's mostly a list of some of the highlights of sort of the bigger acts that were passed after Brigham. And I tried to keep this pretty high level, and I went into some detail on these, but there's so much that happened in all of these acts. If diving even deeper, please let me know and I can send you more information than you probably want. Luckily, the legislative website has historical acts going back to actually before Act 60, so everything is available online. I did put the hyperlinks here if you are interested in reading these bills. So Act 60 was in 1997. Most of the provisions didn't take effect until 1998, although many of them were actually pushed out in subsequent acts. They were amended pretty much. I was actually not surprised, not surprised that all of the Act 60 changes to statute have been changed almost every single year since 1997. So the main point, what everyone knows, Act 64, is that it did create the statewide education property tax. It created the state education fund, so provided different revenue sources for that fund. And I've bullet pointed really the high level points here that it created a uniform tax rate for a minimum block grant. So that's still slightly different from what we have today, as we'll see going through the legislative history. So you had the minimum block grant, and then spending above that grant resulted in a higher town tax rate. I'm also using town somewhat interchangeably for school district here. I apologize. I hope that's not too confusing. But the property tax revenues were, so this is where you get the education fund. This is the beginning of our current system where property tax revenues are pooled in the state education fund and then redistributed based on local spending decisions. What was created was the same tax rate for the same per pupil spending. So that's getting at that inequity issue that was in the foundation formula that was found to be unconstitutional in the Brigham decision. And I do want to point out that it is per pupil spending that did actually predate Act 60, so it was still based on pupils, the amount of spending per pupil. The pre-Act 60 property tax rebate was repealed at that time, and a property tax adjustment was created. So that's our income sensitivity system that we're all familiar with, but it has been amended significantly since Act 60. So what was in statute then is quite different from what we have today, but the sort of skeleton of it was put into statute then. Local control was retained to vote on education spending, so that was the legislative discretion there to retain local control. I noted Act 71, it was the following session because there were significant amendments that were made. Some of it was more technical cleanup, but some of it was more substantive. And then I noted since then there have been changes made to the property tax system every year except I think 2009 or 2010. I didn't seem to find anything, but I may not have been. There probably was something that was changed. So I jumped ahead a few years. At one point I did try and dump in some of those acts, but I don't think they were as significant as Act 68. So really zeroing in on the 2003 changes. So that's where the grand list was split and tax rates were split into homestead and non-residential, which more recently we now call non-homestead. That was, I think, in 2019 that was changed. So the homestead tax rate is what we have now. So based on education spending, per pupil spending, not the amount spent above the block grant. So that's when the block grant was repealed. The non-residential or now non-homestead tax rate was made into a uniform statewide tax rate. Up until 2003, statute did retain the local share property tax and local education spending. That was repealed. Now we just have education spending. The excess spending threshold that I'm sure you're all familiar with was created in 2003 as well. And the property tax adjustment and the homestead declaration were significantly amended. So the way that the property tax adjustment, or I'll just say income sensitivity, was calculated was changed significantly in 2003. I noted that the December 1st letter was added. I found it interesting to see that prior to 2003, it was not just it was a similar sort of ministerial sort of calculation that the Commissioner of Taxes is required to do. And prior to that, it was actually sort of proposing actual yields. So that is still in current statute, although again, it has been amended several times since 2003.
Oh,
I think she pros.
At the time
Abby.
we're depositive. Yes, sorry. I can't.
We
see anything.
lost a few sentences there.
Oh, I'm sorry. It might be my internet. I was talking about the December 1st letter and then the general fund transfer. Is that where I dropped out?
I think we lost you at the general fund transfer.
Okay. I was mostly just reading the slide. So it created the general
Okay.
fund transfer to the education fund, which was, I think I have that in a subsequent slide, was repealed in 2018. They amended the revenues that were deposited into the education fund. I thought it was important to just remind everyone that those have been changed over the years. What money is being deposited into the education fund, which does. And now this is a very hyperlinked slide. I'm trying to cram a lot of different acts and action that was taken after 2003, and I started to try and reproduce all of the changes that have been made to the excess spending threshold and found this very comprehensive summary by Beth St. James Legislative Council last year, I believe. So I just hyperlinked to that. It's a great, yes, 2024. So I'd recommend looking at that if you're interested in seeing the way that the various statutes in Title 16 and 32 have been amended. And I will not, as that's very much outside of my wheelhouse, Act 46 in 2015 with school district mergers. There was a tax rate discount in that, but I would defer to AOE to speak to those changes if you're more interested in information on that. And then I've listed all of the pupil weighting over the last 6-7 years. So Act 173 in 2018, there were several reports and subsequent acts, and then culminating in the 2022 Act 127, changing the pupil weights. So there's a legislative history there. And
Lost you again.
And 100% of sales tax revenues were dedicated to the state education fund. The property tax adjustment was amended and became the property tax credit. It also changed the calculation for the property tax credit, both the house site value and some of the different income thresholds were changed there. And lastly, I hyperlinked, as I'm sure you're all very aware, the 2024 Act 183, creating this commission bill that is passed annually. And that concludes my presentation.D be happy to sort of look into what was in statute before 1998, before Brigham, and look at the minimum versus adequate information and who was actually setting those amounts.
Thanks. Emily, do you want to jump in with
Thank you.
anything else? Thank you.
No, unless I can answer any questions for anyone.
Okay, thank you. One thing I'm struck by, and I had the pleasure of hearing the history of excess spending thresholds. I don't know if anyone else had the opportunity, but just how, or I noticed we had a property tax credit and then we went to a property tax adjustment, and then we went back to a property tax credit. Just how much we have circled around and come back to the same thing multiple times in our fairly brief history here. Any other reflections anyone has or places they'd want us to dive deeper in future meetings? Okay. Then I think we will. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Abby. Really appreciate your time today.
Thank
We
you.
are so deeply ahead of schedule. I don't even know what to do with myself around here. Okay. So next up, we are going to have a conversation about healthcare costs. Very exciting, definitely a major topic of conversation. And I know that we have Mark and Mike over here. Is that right? Okay.
Bobby Joe.
She's going to be virtual.
Yes, I'm here.
Okay. Ah, Bobby Joe is there inside the television, and you are Mark. Hi, nice to meet you. I'm Emily. Okay, fantastic. Thank you all for being here incredibly early. It's very, very, very helpful. Because I think we're going to jump into this next spot on the agenda. So what I think I asked you all via email, but I'll let everyone else know what I asked you, was essentially to just, name that this is considered, healthcare costs is considered one of the cost drivers. I know that all four of you have spent a great deal of time thinking about that, and have done some pretty deep work over the last couple of years to try to see what change and possibility looked like. So really just want to hear from your perspective what's working now, what's not working now, and what could be done to lower healthcare costs while maintaining quality healthcare for our school staff. Wondering if you want to come up in twos, or is that okay? So starting with Mark and Bobby Joe, does that work for you two? Okay, great. If you sit over here, then she
Sure,
can
thank you.
see you. I'm sorry.
Makes sense.
What?
See who's sitting behind me.
Good morning.
Morning.
So just by way of introduction, I'll let Bobby Joe introduce herself. I'm Mark Hage. I'm the Director of Benefit Programs at the Vermont National Education Association. And I have been a VHI Trust Administrator, VHI's Vermont Education Health Initiative, and we'll talk more about that momentarily. I've been in that position for I think 21 years now, give or take. And I have the great pleasure of working with Bobby Joe Sauls and several other colleagues at the Vermont School Board's Insurance Trust, VSBIT. And by the way, there are a lot of V's in this presentation, and as there often are in Vermont. If you need me to clarify any of them, please don't hesitate to ask. Bobby Joe, you want to say a few words?
Sure. Can you hear me okay?
Thank you.
Okay, perfect. My name is Bobby Jo Sauls. I've been working with VHI for the past, I think, 6 or 8 years, depending on which timeline you look at. I worked with Blue Cross of Vermont for 20 years prior to coming to VSBIT to handle the VHI program. So I am the director of the benefit program here at VSBIT.
The information we'll share with you briefly today, and I'll apologize in advance as I often have to do. There's a lot of it. There's a lot of data in health insurance as a rule. We are no exceptions to that rule, but are happy at any time to revisit some of these questions and to take a deeper dive if that would be helpful to the committee and answer any of your questions. Bobby Joe and I had to really scramble to put the testimony together and try to update it. It is based largely on what we shared with the legislature in January and February, 2 different committees. And most of what we're going to share with you is based on our more recent experiences, FY24 and FY25, because we are now only beginning the FY26 rating process and don't have any solid numbers to share with you in that regard. Bobby Joe will be sending you at some point a final copy of this testimony with our masthead on it. But for today's purposes, I hope this will suffice.
Bobby Joe, can you send an unofficial version to Elizabeth Atkins?
I have sent all of them to all of you.
Great. Oh,
It went out about
Okay,
5
thanks.
minutes ago. Yeah.
Excellent.
Can I have another? Can I have one?
Oh, I'm sorry.
It's okay.
So why don't we just anchor ourselves a little bit to what is VHI? Bobby Joe?
Sure. So VHI is, we're a nonprofit. We're self-insured, which means we have to make sure that we have enough money to cover claims for all 35,000 members of VHI. We're considered an intermunicipal insurance trust or an insurance association. We are regulated by DFR. We are not necessarily regulated by the Green Mountain Care Board, although their decisions do sometimes impact our lives. We work with Blue Cross of Vermont directly to handle all the administration as far as claims, claims processing, customer service, actuarial services, et cetera. So they're our major partner in this. So we provide health insurance benefits to right around 36,000 people. Most of them are active employees, but we do have a small portion of retiree benefits or retiree members as well. Our board of directors is made up of 6 people who are appointed, 3 by the Vermont NEA, and then 3 by the VSBA. So again, that's Vermont National Education Association and the Vermont School Boards Association. So there's 3 and 3 on our board. The management team for VHI consists of, as Mark noted, myself, as well as John Steiner and Chris Roberts at Visbit, and then Mark handles really the vast majority of interactions with employees that might be having issues with any of their plans. Let's see, we also offer dental and LTD plans, but health is by far our largest. And we do also at Visbit manage the PATH Wellness Program, which is a longstanding and very popular program with our employees. So we have 4 health insurance plans that we offer. We offer insurance to all public school employees, and we do also have a handful of associations, school-related associations, and some private and independent schools as well. Our Visitors Plan has 3 benefits that we offer, as well as we have a role in their work at VBA for their Medicare Advantage as well. We create our rates for active employees on an annual basis. Our rates change on the fiscal year, but our benefits run on the calendar year. And that's really for the ease and convenience of both the school districts as far as having their budgets in place ahead of time and working with that current year, as well as resetting deductibles and things on a calendar year basis, which makes it a lot easier for employees. We talked about DFR. Let's see. Yes, so cost sharing between the schools and employees is now done at the statewide level. So a number of years ago, it was put into place that we would now have statewide bargaining. So now all teachers and school educators and staff have the same benefits, regardless if they are at District A or District B, which has made it easier for a lot of us in trying to administer these plans, that they all have the same HRAs, they all have the same premium contributions. So that has been helpful. If the committee is interested in hearing any more about plan designs or any of the healthcare funding accounts that we offer, please let me know or us know. So if we hop into talking about the allocation of premium dollars, VHI is covering 30, I think active employees at the beginning of January will be around 34,200 employees and their dependents. So that's obviously a big chunk of Vermonters. But the money that comes in for their premium, it really goes right back out the door in a large part for claims specifically. So, 89% of the premium that we take in goes directly out the door to pay for claims for employees. And for example, for FY25, VHI projects that we'll pay out on average $6.4 million per week for coverage. So just to kind of give you a sense of the dollar magnitude we're dealing with. 4.2% of the entire package goes toward administration between Blue Cross and VHI. A small portion goes toward our wellness program, 0.6%. And we always have run a very lean program at these low percentage amounts, as well as our partners. So any questions on that before I turn it over to Mark? Great.
Bobby Joe, thank you as always. And please, as I'm speaking, if there's something you want to add or clarify or correct, please do.
Thank you.
We'd like to talk a little bit now about what's actually driving premium increases. And I want to begin by stressing that the forces and factors that VHI grapples with annually and has historically are not unique to VHI. At the state, regional, or national level, the same price forces and cost pressures that we deal with, everyone else is dealing with as well. VHI is not unique in that respect. And when we look at what is fundamentally driving premium increases, it's prices. And those prices fall in two general categories: hospital budgets or hospital prices, and also prescription medications, particularly, as you'll see, the cost of specialty drugs, specialty prescriptions, which are by far the most expensive in the market. And again, everyone nationally, according to our independent consultant, Remedy Analytics, is dealing with the same problem. You can see here how our hospital, pharmaceutical, and other costs are sort of broken out. 55% of our costs are attributable to inpatient and outpatient services at our Vermont hospitals, and also some out-of-network hospitals. Prescription medications drive 20% of our cost. So roughly 75% of what VHI pays out can be attributed to hospitals and to RX. And then roughly 4% of our claims are attributable to primary care visits and about 12% to specialty office visits. You can see here in the written testimony what it is we shared with our members in FY24 and FY25 to explain the rate increases. Again, consistent with what I just said, in 2024, increases in medical and pharmacy prices are responsible for virtually the entire increase in F24 premiums, with higher commercial rates charged by hospitals being the most significant factor. And then in FY25, 2/3 of our rate increase was attributable to higher medical prices. Blue Cross also reminded us that year that the main driver, in their opinion, of premium increases in FY24 was rising hospital budgets and the cost of inpatient and outpatient services and pharmaceutical prices. So again, Blue Cross is seeing the same phenomena as we are in their book of business.
The growth of hospital costs compared to the growth in prescription medication costs, are you able to attribute those separately?
Not today, but I think I can get that information for you. Also, we're seeing in the post-COVID era, as everyone else is, an increase in utilization of services. For the FY24 rates, FY25 rate setting, 1/3 of our medical trend increase was pegged to an increase in utilization of services. Conversations with Blue Cross, they believe this is attributable to people finally feeling more comfortable going to a hospital or going to a doctor post-COVID. And I suspect as well, there are needs that were not met. I know, in fact, there were needs that were not met during the COVID years that are now being attended to, and that can lead to higher acuity levels of care, thus higher costs. Finally, also, and Bobby Joe can speak to this authoritatively as well, we had to add in FY25 monies to build our reserves. We are required by the Department of Financial Regulation to have reserves as a matter of good management, fiscal prudence, and we report on our target. And so we had to add 2.6% to our baseline rate increase in order to get our reserves to a place where we felt comfortable. And actually where our regulators felt comfortable. So we want to give you a sense of what actually utilization looks like in a very large risk pool. And this, in fact, would be true for any large risk pool. In fact, it's consistent with data that the federal government has collected for nearly 45 years now. When you look at utilization trends for a large pool, they tend to be stable or consistent from year to year. And utilization is highly concentrated among a relatively small percentage of the population. So for example, if you were to stratify our costs in 2023, what you would find is 1% of our claimants, that would have been roughly 345 people, accounted for 25% of our total spend at an average cost of $255,757 per member per year. Our top 5% of claimants, roughly 1,700 people, accounted for 52% of our total spend at an average of $104,854 per member per year. The bottom 50% of our claimants, more than 17,000, accounted for just 4% of total cost at an average of $927 per member per year. And to put a finer point on this, if you look at those members of our pool who are deemed high cost, that is, they've had claims that exceed $100,000. In 2023, there were 474 of those individuals out of a pool, as Bobby Joe said, roughly 34,200. Actually, it was a little higher then, probably 34,500 then. But their total costs were in excess of $98 million. And of that 474 patients, 283 of them, roughly 60%, were new to this cohort. So what this data shows you is that in any given year, most members in a large pool, and this is true for VHI, do not get a lot of medical care. But the ones that do can be very, very costly, again, chiefly because of hospital prices and pharmaceutical prices. Going a little faster now because I know you have a lot on your plate today. Looking at pharmacy, again, we're looking at the first 9 months here of 2023. We can certainly update these figures if you would like. Our RX cost just for those first 9 months, was $55.1 million. That's before rebates, compared to $46.2 million the previous year. You can see in the next bullet what the percent increases were for specialty drugs, the overall inflationary trend for RX, and then for non-specialty medications, all of them exceeding 20%. Now, specialty medications, as I mentioned a few moments ago, they account for better than 56% of our total spend right now. Now, in the first 9 months of 2023, that was a cost of $30.9 million for roughly 829 patients. This group represented just 3.2% of our total patient count and 2.3% of our total claim count. But again, as small as those percentages are, the aggregate cost is staggering. And Bobby Joe and I have watched that 56%, or the percent of our total spend on RX, climb pretty dramatically over the course of the last decade with respect to specialty medications. You'll see what the average gross cost for a specialty medication was during this time period, in excess of $37,000, compared to $155 for the medications that 21,633 of our members took. The great majority of these would have been generic medications, and they cost somewhere between $1 and $1,000. 84% of our claims are for generic. Again, we've worked really hard over the last 2 decades to educate our members about the importance of generic medications, why they're medically efficacious, why they help us to control costs, and to consider using them. And most of our members heeded that advice, and we've been proud to keep that number where it is. We'd like to see it a little higher, but it signals that our members are listening to our advice in this regard. We work with an independent consultant on RX, Remedy Analytics, and we also work with a very fine pharmacy team at Blue Cross Blue Shield of Vermont, and those 2 partners work together on our behalf. And we are always collaborating with Remedy and Blue Cross to try to find ways to mitigate these cost increases. But it's a challenge. Big pharma and pharmacy benefit managers, they have a lot of power, they have a lot of influence. 4 pharmacy benefit managers control 80% of the market in the United States. There's no real competition here. So looking at the future, and Bobby Joe, this is where we can tag team if you like, please. In terms of how we're going to control costs in the future, what we can do internally, as well as watching and supporting where we can, what's happening externally with healthcare reform. Our board of directors heard a presentation on reference-based pricing benchmarked to Medicare rates in 2023 for both inpatient and outpatient services. To put it very simply, reference-based pricing for hospital services is when you reimburse hospitals based on a multiple of what Medicare pays. Medicare rates are set nationally, as you know. They're intended to be fair, they're transparent, we know how they're established, and there's been a growing interest nationally in reference-based pricing. And our board of directors heard a presentation on it from one of the country's experts in 2023. Our interest in it was also inspired by my interest in a report by State Auditor Doug Hoffer in 2021, which showed that there could be significant savings for the state employees pool. He wasn't looking at our pool, but the state employees pool, if we move to a reference-based pricing model of some kind. And those savings could total annually as much as $16.3 million.
I feel like we spend a lot of time talking about, and maybe it's just like the little pool that I swim in, but I feel like there's been a lot of conversation about medical costs in the school system and very little conversation about medical costs in the state employee system. And maybe that, again, is just like the little place that I'm living, but I don't know if other people have had that
There
experience.
was a lot of talk in the past. There was a lot of effort to get pharmaceutical prices. There was a legislative, ended up as the New England legislative, and then I think it may have gone national legislative on pharmaceutical pricing. There's been asks. There were bus trips organized to Canada.
Yes.
Senator Sanders had bus trips. There are now online pharmacies, but I know Vermont, it is now allowed federally to get permission to buy from Canadian pharmacies. I know Vermont has requested that permission. I haven't been on healthcare for 2 years, but as of 2 years ago, we had not received that permission. I know individuals can buy online. I don't know how legal it is, but there is an online Canadian pharmacy that if your doctor sends your prescription, and the savings are significant, at least for the ones where there was a generic. I mean, significant.
And I think I was asking in the context of like the pressure on budgets in this fiscal year. And I'm really glad you're here talking about this. It's just interesting how little, I imagine the exact same pressures are on the
Yes.
general fund budget, and we're just not talking about it in the same way.
Well, I'd be interested in plan design comparisons between the Beehive plans and the state employee plans, as well as premium costs. But again, the reason it's coming up is because it's
Felt much more immediately.
yes, I mean, Vermonters aren't approving the state's budget the way they're improving their local budget, school
Yeah,
budgets.
I think a lot of those conversations likely happen when we as state agencies get our budget instructions, right?
Yeah.
And we've got our targets and,
And there's no way to
hopefully,
come in.
hopefully we've met them when we come to the legislature.
And there was a lot of discussion in the past. I know at one point when I was on healthcare, so probably 4 or 5 years ago, we were told, we don't care what you do, but keep your hands off our prescription program, because state employees had gotten, they thought, a really good prescription program. We've been through formularies, we've been through wellness programs. It quieted down. You kind of go in cycles and you do everything you can. But there was, in the recent past, meaning the last 8 to 10 years, a focus on the state employees plan. And then we seem to find some equilibrium, or maybe we just got tired and gave up.
And I'm sorry I interrupted you.
No, not at all. I mean, this is an important conversation. And I hope it's comforting to know that the Vermont State Employees Association and Vermont NEA went to the legislature in 2024, secured an allocation of $15,000 in order to do a reference-based pricing analysis of our hospital claims. That's roughly 60,000 covered lives. And both associations believe strongly, in fact, that reference-based pricing is going to be a very important part of the conversation around hospital budgets in the near future. In fact, the Act 167 report recommends that the Green Mountain Care Board, beginning next year, look at hospital budget protocols that reference those hospital budgets to Medicare rates at 200% or less of Medicare. And what got us very interested in this approach, among other things we're interested in together, is that the state of Montana actually implemented reference-based pricing in 2017. They did it hospital by hospital through contract negotiations. And they established a range of reimbursements for inpatient and outpatient, again, pegged to Medicare rates. It affected 31,000 covered lives. These were just state employees and their dependents. Educational employees and their dependents were not affected by this. And yet, in the first 2 years, Montana lowered costs. I want to stress, when I say lowered, I don't mean bend the proverbial cost curve. I mean, they actually lowered prices by $48 million based on an independent audit.
I was really excited when I heard about that. And then I heard recently that they were stepping away. Can you speak to
What
that
I
a little bit?
understand, and I can get you more information on this, is that certain political dynamics changed.
Okay, that's
Montana
what I
State
wasn't sure if it was
Legislature.
that.
But the reference-based pricing model was working fabulously. In fact, it not only lowered costs by the amounts I stated, it restored the Montana healthcare reserves to a very healthy level. They were dangerously low. So much so, in fact, that the state legislature began taking money from those reserves in order to fund non-healthcare policy initiatives. The state of Oregon has probably moved the most dramatically in this regard. It has a reference-based pricing model for 24 of its 62 hospitals, the largest, largely urban or semi-urban based hospitals. They affect 300,000 public sector employees, including state employees, municipal and school employees. They peg their reimbursement rates at 200% of Medicare for in-network care and 185 for out-of-network care. And independent study published in the Health Affairs Journal this year, pegged the savings in the first 2 years at $107.5 million. And this is based on a much smaller percentage of claims than you would normally see because of the COVID impact. A Willis Towers Watson audit report of the same program put the savings during the same 2 years at $171 million. So I suspect that the real number is somewhere between those two polls, but it's very significant. As I said, the Oliver Wyman report is urging us to move in that direction as a state. Bobby Joe and I are actually proud of the fact that our board of directors was talking about this early on and saw the potential for it. And we certainly keep tracking what's happening in the legislature and at the Green Mountain Care Board with this. And we're looking forward to the results of our own analysis, which will be available sometime in mid-December, I believe. Also, VHI endorsed the Prescription Drug Affordability Board in 2023 and 2024. Maryland was the first state to move forward on this. It's a board that attempts to regulate and bring more transparency and cap the cost of these high-cost specialty drugs that I talked to you about. We're going to have our own version of PDAB in the near future because the legislature did authorize the creation of a new division at the Green Mountain Care Board with staff to begin building a framework and a methodology for identifying what's driving RX costs and again to begin capping those high costs. There's no magic sauce to national health insurance systems around the world. What they generally do that we don't do is they regulate prices, and they do that in the pharmacy field as well as the hospital field. Now, finally, we can look at what VHI is thinking about internally with benefit design. As I already stated, we're going to keep working with Remedy. And we have begun talking about investigating alternative pharmacy benefit PBMs. As I said, there are 4 nationally that control about 80% of the market. And yet there's this new cohort, 6, 7 of them, very reputable, establishing a good reputation for themselves nationally in different markets. And they argue that they can bring the same services to a pool like VHI or the state employees. And they can do so with greater transparency and with much lower margins. The margins for a PBM nationally, an Optum, for example, Express Scripts, et cetera, can be anywhere from 30 to 40%. They operate at a much lower margin and deliver the fundamental services. Whether this will work for our pool and work for Vermont, we don't know, but we're going to begin that process of investigating it relatively soon. And then there's some other services and plans that we're investigating related to our benefit designs. Bobby Joe, you want to take this last part? I'm happy to keep talking, but I'm happy to have you talk as well.
Sure. So, we changed our plan designs back in 2018. So we think it's time to, revisit that again and look at the number of plans that we offer, as well as the type of plans that we offer, possibly expanding access to telehealth. We currently have a telehealth benefit through Blue Cross, but that is something that people have to sign in for and pay for. So we want to look into other options for that. We did just recently implement a virtual physical therapy benefit, which has really taken off quite quickly. We also want to explore, access to primary care. Obviously, primary care is difficult to get into in the state of Vermont. It's hard to find a primary care physician if you're new. So finding access to primary care, mental health, and chronic disease management, obviously always on the top of our list, trying to find affordable ways to do that by hopefully diverting patients to a better use of services with high quality outcomes as well. I think Mark noted centers of excellence. Perhaps not. Centers of excellence are, places that really focus in on one particular thing. It could be, heart transplants. It could be cancer related, but focusing on those. And then also, checking into our wellness program to see if there are other things that we can do within our wellness program to bring, additional cost savings to fruition. So Mark, you want to close up?
Yes, thank you. I would just add to Bobby Joe's comments about primary care, mental health, chronic disease management. Most costs in any risk pool, overwhelmingly, they're driven by chronic disease, trying to keep people healthy and keep them out of the hospital and out of ER. From the data we shared today, and again, this will be true for any large risk pool, we're going to lower costs in any kind of dramatic fashion without eroding essential coverage. We've got to address the hospital price conundrum, and we got to address these RX prices. And so it was interesting to us to see in the Act 167 report this very strong, almost existential urgency about directing care as much as possible out of hospitals in the long term back to the community. Because we know if people are seeing a primary care doctor, as Bobby Joe noted, their chronic diseases are under control. If they're drug adherent, that's the other big problem, prescription drug adherence. If we can meet those tests at the community level, we are going to keep people out of the hospital. Don't need to be there. You need to be there, obviously. You need to be there. But if we can get people into the community-based settings and use benefit design, and I hope future state reforms to do that, I think that's where we're going to begin to see some significant cost savings. And so the Act 167 report for us, I think, is a very significant document. I think there's going to be I hope there's going to be a lot of really deep discussion around its recommendations. We're going to be following all of that. And as Bobby Joe noted, sort of continuing to look at what we're doing internally with our benefit designs and our wellness program to keep our members as healthy as we can and to lower costs. I think that is our whirlwind tour of healthcare.
I have a quick question. When other states have moved to reference-based pricing, how quickly have they seen those cost savings that you just
In Montana's example, the first year of implementation, I believe, was 2017, 2018, and they began to see savings almost immediately.
Like $100 million worth of savings?
They saw 48 million in 2 years. And not all the hospitals in Montana were impacted, but the major ones were. And again, that was a negotiation by negotiation. And I don't know what the savings were post 2019. And we're still waiting for data to come in from the states of Washington, Colorado. Nevada has passed a bill related to, I think, its exchange market and RBP. New Jersey is now debating RBP. We just met with some union colleagues in New York who are also looking at the possibility. So I think this conversation about hospital prices is going to be fundamental to healthcare reform going forward. And if we do it well, smartly, I think the savings will be substantial.
It's around like a 5-year window for being sort of fully implemented. Is that what you're saying?
I don't know what the window is.
Okay.
Looking at the Act 167 report, if I remember correctly, it recommended that the board begin moving toward reference-based pricing model of some kind beginning next year. And again, based on 200% or less of Medicare, depending on what the numbers are and what the hospitals need. And then that report, of course, also flagged the sustainability issues that our hospitals have.
And I think I'm wondering how long, once it's implemented, do you get a full realization of savings?
I think you're going to get a full realization of your potential, at least, after year one. Because the Oregon folks went into the Oregon plan went into effect in 2019, and 2 years later they were showing savings of $107 million.
Thank you.
Or $171 million, depending on who's doing the count.
Okay, thanks. Yeah.
So my question's about plan design. Having served on the VHI board way back when, I know that part of the plan design that you referenced, Bobby Joe, was desire to move to high deductible plans that had a different pricing structure and cost sharing structure. So part of this costs are going up across the board, no matter who's getting health insurance, right? And I think in the context of school benefits and other public employee benefits, it's also a question of who's paying what costs, how those costs are shared. And so my understanding, based on now a couple of rounds of statewide negotiations, with maybe a bridge to the next presenters, but that the benefits that have been negotiated there really resulted in out-of-pocket costs being covered pretty significantly by the employers, which back when I was a school business manager, there was some conversation around, we've essentially replicated the Platinum Plus plans we had before we made all the plan designs to move to the higher deductible plans, because employers are covering most of the costs. So I'm just wondering if that's part of the conversation too at the VHI board around plan design. Does it make sense to continue to move with these high deductible plans that result in a lot of administrative costs on the district side in terms of administering the HRAs or HSAs, when the other plans did not have that administrative requirement and essentially covered the same cost just through premium as opposed to an HRA? Is that part of the conversation that the board's going to have?
Questions are going to be on the table, and I appreciate your raising the question of administrative simplification, because at present, those plans can be very complicated for central office staff as well as for. But I
think some of the bumps in the road were ironed out, I hope, but the first couple of years were pretty.
They were really
rocky.
hard, yeah, and some of them have been roughed out. In fact, a lot of them have worked out. That doesn't mean it's simple, though.
Yeah.
Right? It doesn't mean it isn't taking people a lot of time to figure things out, and doesn't mean that central offices still aren't having to spend more time, perhaps, than they would like.
Right.
On administration.
If we just moved to a plan that just covered it as part of the premium and went back to copays.
So I think all that's going to be on the table.
Any other questions from anyone? We're staying with this topic. We're just switching presenters. Thank you so much. This
Thank you
was
for your
very
patience.
helpful for me.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
And thanks for the quick response time on the invite. We're meeting every 2 weeks, and
No,
so
it's
the
fine.
agenda setting
It's
is
fine.
really
Yeah, no, it's fine.
Yeah,
Keep having
moving
to
target.
have to do.
Yeah, thanks.
you. Thank you very well.
Would you two like to join us? Hello, welcome. Floor is yours.
I'm Mark Koenig. Sit here. I'm co-chair of the Healthcare Commission that we were just talking about.
And I'm Mike Campbell, co-chair partner from the employees side of the Public Schools Employees Healthcare Commission.
So Mark just kind of covered everything I could have possibly thought. I don't know if you want to go like the history of where we are and what we're trying to do right now, or if you just want to go into questions.
I would love the history of where we are and what you two think we should do.
The bargaining is different from the health plan.
Right. That was one of the things I was thinking. So in 2018, the Healthcare Commission was created in a way to try and stabilize healthcare costs. First round happened. Went into the second round. I think Mike's, you've been here the whole round. I got into it on the second round. The third round was supposed to start this past April, and I gave Mike a call and we had a long heart-to-heart talk saying, we're going to spend the next 9 months fighting over plans that neither of us like for different reasons. And we're going to have essentially the same thing at the end of this, and the whole system's broken. Could we take a year or so to try and figure out, is there a way that we can figure how to save some money or save some heartache? Mike took it to his group. He came back and said, we think that's great, but a year's not enough. Can we have 2 years? So because the way the agreement was written, the commission could extend it in writing. So we extended it for 2 years. So the last agreement stays in effect. And we started trying to go to work and have talked to amongst ourselves, to VHI. We've had discussions with Green Mountain Care. And while all this was happening, unbeknownst to us when we started this, it became a topic for a lot of people. So the hospital report that just came out, and Green Mountain Care is doing things 127 exploded in our faces. That became a hot topic that we suddenly are like, oh, we're not the only ones. We thought we were just going to be by ourselves trying to figure out what can we do. And now we're one of many voices that we're trying to corral all of them into one megaphone to make some change.
And I'd like to add, I'd like to focus a point on traditional adversarial relationship between the two sides of the commission that ended up in arbitration both times. And this time when we stepped together, and I think this is a powerful statement to why we're sitting here together right now physically, and why we've met so many times and worked so diligently together, is that when we have more in common than we have against each other, that's a statement. And as Mark points out, the entire industry is and political landscape, healthcare landscape, all of that's coming together at the same time. It's an interesting place to be. And our goal is to continue having high quality, accessible, equitable healthcare that's affordable. That's our goal. And when we can do that, we can keep the staff in the state that meets the students' needs. And really, everybody in this room, when they think about it, have asked, what's their driving concern? Students' needs. Students are at the heart of all of this. And I just want to focus that point that we really do have a lot more to work together on than we have dividing us. And it was not a hard decision to come to on both sides to say, neither one of us can afford this. No matter who we argue or an arbitrator decides is going to pay for this, neither one of us can afford the scale that this is hitting each of our groups. And in the end, a reform to the system helps everybody in the state. Taxpayer. I mean, I have a whole list of people who this helps. Everybody is a beneficiary of us being working together to find reforms in the healthcare system.
So at the minimum, we hope to get out of this after 2 years is, as Bobby Joe was saying, changing the plans, and whether that's going from 4 plans to 2 plans, or whether it goes back to something that's more reflective of pre-2018, 2016, whenever we change those. Looking at what the state does, because for the cost to the state and the state employees versus like school districts and school employees is relatively the same. There's different structured plans, but the premiums and stuff are relatively equal. And if you talk to state employees, they look at the healthcare plan for public school employees and they're like, oh, I really wish we had that. And the teachers will look over at the health plan like, we really wish we had that. So it might be interesting to try and figure out when we are redesigning, like, okay, what's the best of both worlds that won't break the bank and make it easier. And I think Mike can attest that there are members of Vermont NEA who would prefer going back to a co-play. They think it's the whole HRA and when it is and when it isn't is confusing for the users as much as it is for the business offices. So that's the least we want to be able to do is at least come out and have plans that are better represent what our members want and are still affordable and make use. Biggest things are a lot of things that Mark was talking about, reference-based and changing of capping prescription drugs and centers of excellence, higher education to the end users about generic drugs, or maybe don't go to the ER because it's going to cost, or how to manage your chronic illness in a more effective manner, all that kind of thing. Working with VHI closely on trying to integrate those pieces that are just, they might be a low-hanging fruit, but that might be cost effective.
I'd like to shift focus a little bit onto a key dynamic here and an impact. And I do not want in any way this to be a finger pointing. We went toe-to-toe negotiations, right out straight, right to arbitration the first time and an arbitration panel the second time. I mean, we went full at it, the way you negotiate in tough circumstances. One of the things that, and you pointed out, and it's correct, that we've come back to a plan that is less the high deductible plan and more the traditional, because that seems to have worked best for the employees. I also want to point out that we were able to shift out of the first out-of-pocket cost from the employee to the employer. But there's a significant, for a family plan, the last $1,000 before it goes, there's a donut hole of $1,000. And somebody who has a chronic illness that hits, and they hit that's a significant, bad timing, to have it hit. We argued about HRAs, HSAs, and all of those kinds of things. But ultimately, the arbiter and the arbitration panel came to those conclusions, and we live by the victories and losses from those. What I want to point out, though, is in this state, all of you must have heard from your constituents, so the people that you work with, how difficult it is to keep paraprofessionals, ESP members, working in our districts. We have, in my district, 20 that aren't filled. They simply aren't filled. The way that these plans have worked out, those folks are making the least amount of money among us and are paying 20% of the premium in a full plan. And they're living on a knife's edge, where, quite honestly, some of them are deciding not to live on that nice economic knife's edge. And some of them are just not picking up the option of working within the school system and doing the important things that they do for our students. I'm an active teacher, high school teacher, Bellisbury Academy, St. Albans, 26 years. And with any luck, I can get back and teach my period 7. So my point is, I'm right there, and I see it every day, and I help represent that every day. And I think that the culmination of all of these costs come to bear on that particular group of our educational staff most difficult, in the most difficult way. And I think I want to shove that out for the conversation to hear.
I can say, as a superintendent, I just had this conversation with a paraprofessional on Thursday about that exact same point.
Yes. It's heart-wrenching when that's the decision you're making, instead of it being about the student. These folks do some wonderful things and necessary things in our system, and then you don't have them, the student suffers.
So where did they go? Did they go unemployed or lesser employment and end up on Medicaid? Is that a better deal? I mean, what?
I would say they go, and I very careful of poking bears here. So I would say they go to jobs that pay more money per hour.
Oh, okay.
They find employment that actually
pays
a higher rate and more commensurate to what they're doing with students.
Same reason people leave our designated agencies.
Right.
Yeah.
Um,
And I have no data on that, except anecdotal,
do you all have a sense of, if you were able to achieve all the things that you are talking about, how much savings we might see?
Mark went into this in depth. The cost drivers are not, when we negotiate, we're negotiating a set premium and deciding who's going to pay what. We have no control over what that premium is.
Mhm.
And so we're just on who's covering which bucket of money at the time, but how much it's going to cost anything is beyond us. So we're hoping a lot of the numbers that would coming up would be usable. And I think that's one of the big reasons we decided to just put a hold on it, because wasn't going to change anything that was going to cost either employer or employee. It was just who's going to divide more, and we were going to fight 10 months over a couple $100 of dividing it here or there. At the end of the day, wouldn't change anything, and I just didn't have the mental strength to have that fight when we needed to figure out, well, why is this happening, and what can we back out and look at it anew?
I think you have an entirely different conversation when you negotiate fourth contract, when you can have substantive monetary reform, and structural reform that leads to monetary reform. I think you have an entirely different two groups sitting down at the table having a conversation, because the sky isn't falling. So I think that's an important aspect. It takes some of that pressure off of it. And I know Mark and I will be either at the front of the line, the middle of the line, the back of the line, whatever part of the line works best in trying to gather or be part of a movement that says much of what Mark has talked about, those reforms in of themselves could be a significant start to doing that. We pushed for 2 years only because of the nature of the systemic delay and everything. You're already a year ahead in setting rates, and Mark called me a month ago and said, we're already 6 months into our 2 years. Like he's getting a little, he was having that, and yeah, then we would be starting talking about arguing over who's paying what again. So we're really hoping to be part of something that moves more quickly.
So takeaway is, we're not going to accomplish healthcare reform in time for the FY26
We don't
budget
think-
process. And the contract's locked in for another 18 months. So
Yeah, I mean,
for us,
whatever
to be
you're
talking
doing
about healthcare is a short-term cost containment
is zero.
is not a good use of our
Yeah,
time.
I heard like some rumbling rumors that maybe the General Assembly might go in and try and tweak the current agreement, which just sent
Well,
shivers.
that
up
always
my
goes
spine.
over really well in
Yes.
the General
Where did you
Assembly.
hear that?
I don't know. I'm not gonna spread more rumors, but that I heard that, I was like, oh, thank God,
Zero
please don't.
political appetite in my
I was like, that would be,
observation.
well, it's like,
Here with
it's a
collective bargaining
contract
rights.
already set. You're just gonna mess things up if you try that. There's no levers you could pull in that contract that would make anybody happy, and it won't say anything. So
One other question I had though was whether there's been any discussion around sort of combined the actuarial benefits or not of combining all the public employees into a single pool, risk pool. Right now, we've got the school employees have their own risk pool, the state employees have their own risk pool. I know there've been discussions over the years around, if you make a bigger pool, do you have better bargaining power? Or do the
Can I add a flavor to that question? So, and I don't want to have like too many pension flashbacks here. But I'm wondering if my assumptions are correct that school employees tend to be healthier but access care more. And state employees tend to be less healthy but access care less often. And I don't know if that's okay.
No, but.
Okay.
So.
Okay, great.
Interesting.
Okay.
Our prevention figure might be higher than PI.
Okay, that's the kind of thing that I'm
But
thinking
not
about.
quite sure
Okay.
that dig into-
Okay, so I'd just be,
There's also the state colleges employees,
Yeah.
have their own pool. I mean, there's lots of
Yeah.
pools of public
Yeah.
employees out
The
there.
question is who within that pool has the higher claims.
Yeah.
Right.
That's, they would, VHI would understand.
so have you all discussed that?
I think, could I go ahead, maybe take a jab at that? I think that that's a very sensitive topic.
Yeah.
Where you have to have those people at the
Yeah.
table before you
Yeah.
add them to the table. I don't know that all those parties have been engaged in that kind of conversation. And so for us to start saying, that's our goal, that's our aim.
I was just
think-
asking whether that was a conversation.
I think
that
right,
is one of the people we want to talk to, though. Even if we weren't to do some sort of merger, we definitely want to talk to the different large pools to say, hey, can we collectively speak out? And, as opposed to just our 35,000, now we have, a couple of those pools. Now we're getting close to 100,000. We got a sixth of the entire population of the state speaking with one voice. We're not merging at an administrative level. We have the same wants and needs for more affordable healthcare.
those same cost drivers are hitting them as much as they're hitting us. So, so I like how you stated that just as common cause as we have now common cause. I can't see anybody in the healthcare receiving that healthcare and paying for it isn't gonna want to see these reforms. These reforms they don't separate people. I think they bring people together.
And we have to have sensitive conversations in this room, and they're all like, we're talking about local control and Brigham decision and healthcare, like it's, collective bargain, like we're just gonna have all the sensitive conversations and everyone will be mad at us at the end of every single meeting. And that's the only way we're gonna get anything done. So thank you for sitting at the table for that. And
Probably I'm the one that's more of the veteran of the healthcare wars than anyone. Because the finance committee regulates health insurance, so we've been in the middle of it. At one point, we tried to get the mental health agencies, who really are arms of state government, into the state employees' health pool. And we were told that was a negotiated agreement. And unless they wanted to leave it, they were out. So there's all kinds of negotiated issues that go with that and labor issues. But this is a national issue. I mean, we aren't alone here. The cost of those, I think it was Ozempic, but it was one of the new weight loss drugs. And they had the head of the pharmaceutical company on one of the news shows. And they were saying, but this costs like $50 in Finland and it costs $200 in the United States. Why is that? It basically got to what will the market bear? Mm-hmm. We don't regulate pharmaceutical prices or profits. These are private businesses and they make what they need to make because people need what they make to survive. And it's really difficult at the Vermont level. And we aren't a big enough insurance pool to really go it alone. We've tried that twice and the bill has come in and nobody would have the political courage to public that cost because the implications for individuals was huge.
And the environment is quite different now, given our property tax bills that we're all facing. And if the state employees would like to give any health insurance, I'd be happy to join the pool.
Are actually a shrinking pool, and we're getting to be an older, more expensive pool. And the whole teachers' healthcare, retired healthcare, had there was no pool under it until we did the pension reforms, and we capitalized or in the process of capitalizing that pool. So we aren't paying it out of the annual intake. We just went on your property taxes, paid for it. We are making some progress, but it's painful and very difficult for Vermont to control. We can nibble around the edges. I mean, I don't know if we're still doing it, but we went so far as to ban pharmaceutical companies from coming in. And my sister was a detailer for some time. That's what you do when you go to doctor's offices and you tell about your new legendary pink pill, or I think we always talked about the purple pill, and the new and improved formula, and you buy lunch for everybody in the office and you leave lots of samples. And then we found out if you didn't distribute those samples, they were getting the records from, not with names, but how many of those purple pills were being prescribed. And the doctors got phone calls saying, gee, we came in, we bought you lunch and you haven't done this. We tried to ban them getting that information. We lost in court. And I think we haven't had those discussions recently because in the past, we haven't been all that successful in really curbing the rise. We may slow it down a little bit, but we have, again, as a nation, a very unique way of dealing with healthcare.
Right now, I would accept a slowing of the rise, though other things would be good.
But if we'll do what we did with electricity, we'll say it won't go up as much as it would have if we do these reforms.
Do you two have anything else you want to share with us at this time? We will certainly have time to dive in deeper into all of this in the future, but I appreciate you coming in to whet our appetites for.
Bring the whole room down.
No, I think
we're good.
Okay, thank you so much. Thanks for the long drive in the middle of your school day. Thanks for the slightly shorter drive in the middle of your work day. Really?
Some shorter.
Really? Okay, thanks for your very long drive.
Elizabeth raised her hand.
Oh, Elizabeth, I'm so sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
That's okay. I just wanted to ask, in regards to the timeline for renegotiating on the healthcare, from the state level and the commission for that, what if the structure of the plans does change coming from VHI before you all are planning to renegotiate? Wouldn't that force having to move faster on renegotiating if the structure of the plans changed in any way?
Well, I would assume that the structure, just because they would structure the plans, those would be what would go into effect that the next time they would be negotiated. So we would be stuck with the old ones until we had the new ones in place. I don't think you could just say, oh, tomorrow there's a new plan and here it is.
I think you're caught up in the timeline of events that I think VHI is probably going to need all that time and more to actually make those changes. So.
And if we're still working on, if the plan is possibly going to be implemented later than when we would start negotiations, we can always bump it another 6 months or a year through mutual agreement that, well, we have new plans coming. Let's wait until those are set in stone so that we know what we're negotiating on. That's a lot of maybes, though.
Yeah, there's a lot of bridges.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Thank you both. Thanks all four of you. That was really helpful. We are going to shift gears again. And we are going to talk about special education and Act 173. Megan, I think, is joining us virtually. Ah, look at all that magic. Hello, Megan. Thank you. And then I think after that, we'll just take like a brief break to stretch. So invited Megan to talk about in her role as previous chair of the Act 173 advisory group, not in her role as the chair of the full commission, because I think Act 73 was assumed by many to be a path to both policy improvement and cost reductions. And my understanding is it's been neither, but I'd love to move beyond my assumptions and into a little more information. So Megan, the floor is yours.
Sure. My internet is stable at the moment, but it had a moment about 10 minutes ago. So hopefully I'm good for the whole time. I did not prep slides or anything like that. I will share a couple of things related to those two highlights that Emily just talked about, and then I'm happy to answer questions. So the first thing that I would say, kind of to pick up the thread around cost containment for Act 173, Act 173, which was passed in 2018, was designed to change the funding mechanism for special education, and it grew out of the funding study of special ed, which is one of the many links that I think this committee read. So I won't go into detail about the highlights of that study, but it really came about because our funding system, which at the time, prior to 2018, was a reimbursement model. That means that for every special education eligible dollar that a school district spent, they would receive reimbursement in state special ed dollars, roughly 56-ish%, with some additional reimbursement for extraordinary costs. And that funding model was found to be incredibly inflexible. So school districts did not have a lot of flexibility with what they could do with state special education dollars. There was concern that it incentivized spending, because spending coded as a special education expense, you would be eligible for at least half that cost to come back to the district. And it was incredibly burdensome from a documentation standpoint for school districts. There are other things in the study, but those are some of the primary drivers. And quite frankly, concerns about rising special ed costs. I mean, I think that kind of goes without saying, but that is part of why Act 173 came about. And that law, by design, was designed to both improve practices in schools and change our funding model. And I start with that comment because it's a theme that this group and the full commission has talked about and probably will talk about. When you provide services better, you can often do so more efficiently and effectively. So that is part of the promise of Act 173, and I will talk about some of the challenges. The priorities for Act 173 were to enhance the effectiveness, availability, and equity of services provided to students who require additional support. It was meant to strengthen districts' multi-tiered systems of support and not just increase supports for special education students. And the state funding model provided more flexibility, was aligned with the state's priorities for serving students who struggle, and was designed to simplify administration. I would say in terms of whether or not it's been able to realize some of those promises, the biggest challenge from the perspective of school districts, and again, speaking as the chair of the advisory group, census-based funding advisory group, that group's lifespan extended much beyond its original because of the number of times the law was delayed. And a lot of the recommendations of that group remained largely unchanged over the course of that time. The advisory group did spend a lot of time on rulemaking, but they also spent a lot of time making recommendations about programmatic implementations. And I would say it's the opinion of the advisory group that implementation support did not meet its goals. And school districts, there's still an incredible amount of variability in school districts' ability to implement the programmatic side of Act 173, so implementing multi-tiered system of supports. And generally, if you pass a law that is designed to improve services and costs, if you are not successful in improving how services are delivered, then you often won't be successful in improving costs or containing costs. So I think that's just overall. I know the report that the full commission saw, kind of the initial data from the state of the state, shows what the increases in special education spending are at. So I would say there's two things that jump out in my mind as things specific to funding and cost drivers. Actually, I'll say three things. One of them's been mentioned, but one is just simply because spending is no longer reimbursed on services that are provided to special ed students. We no longer are in a reimbursement model. School districts receive their funding through a census-based grant. Districts have to spend those funds. They have to provide special ed services. They're an entitlement service. So if the amount that you are spending exceeds the amount of your census-based funding grant, you still spend that as a school district. And so school districts general ed fund, for lack of a better word, that's not a technical, function object phrase, but the rest of your education budget is going to have to pay for what would have been reimbursed special ed costs, because spending is increasing more than the cost of living inflator that's attached to the census-based grant. So they have to spend, costs are going up, but they receive less state special ed support. So that is the most significant and relevant cost driver related to special ed. The other thing that I would say, this was the point I'm adding because it came up earlier, special ed continues to be the place where districts most likely see mental health costs. So that cost shift that has been in place and identified since long before Act 173 continues, because many of the kids who would be accessing mental health supports through community-based services are often eligible for special education. Therefore, special education is where those costs come from. Those continue to rise. If students can't access therapists and other family-based supports in the community, they're going to access them in school. So that cost shift exists, and you may see that in special education even more so than the general ed side of the budget. And
Megan,
this-
can I, if I ask you a question now, is that going to blow your whole
Nope.
role? Okay.
Nope.
Given that I think one of the hardest things about this conversation globally, outside of special education even, is that like the cost shifting is really hard to find unless you're like deep in the nitty gritty, and the cost shifting is in some ways key to actually understanding cost drivers and reducing those cost drivers. So when you describe that whole situation that you described just now, how would we even be able to see it if we were looking at the data?
So I'm not actually sure it would be as, okay, I'm going to be careful what I say here, but I'm not sure it would be as hard as you think. So pre-Act 173, actually before even the special ed study, the legislature actually asked to say how much of a special ed budget is being spent right now on what could be termed mental health services. And it was an analysis of function object codes. I can never put my fingers on the actual document that resulted. But it was significant in terms of the number, the amount. But also that was actually collected by a survey to special ed directors. So now with the Uniform Chart of Accounts, again, I don't want to speak for folks who could pull that data, but I do think that you would be able to pull it because of how it's coded, is my sense.
Okay, thank you. Do you know who authored that analysis that you can't seem to get your hands on?
No, I don't. I feel as though it came out of either House or Senate Ed. I believe it was a study convened by the legislature. I can't tell you how many times I've looked for it recently.
Do you have any idea what year?
I want to say somewhere between, let's see, the funding study was 2016, so it was before then. Yeah.
Thanks.
To Megan's point, having worked in two different systems, I can give a real basic example of a behavior interventionist. The system I worked in before, that would have been funded out of the mental health system. And that is funded through our budget. So that is a cost driver to the education fund. So that's a real easy comparison I can see because it is a different model that we use in Vermont.
Thanks.
I think to Megan's point too, the dynamic that I observed early on was just because the state, first of all, the block grant does not account for need in any way. So there's no weighting. It's a straight census count. But number two, special education services are legal entitlements through an IEP or different type of
under
plan.
federal law.
Yes. So unless school districts are able to work within the legal process for changing what an IEP looks like and the types of services. So the study was great at saying we're over reliant on one-on-ones, on paraeducators, it's not effective. But if you have a bunch of IEPs that legally mandate a school district provide a one-on-one, that's a student by student process that has to play out. And I did not see the level of technical and legal assistance provided to districts and how to manage that conversation with families that are like, whoa, I fought for years to get this in my child's IEP. I am not going to agree. So I just think it's not a matter of just waving a wand and saying, we're going to change the way we fund things and now you don't have to do it anymore. Just do the best practice. It's do the best practice through a consultation negotiation with an IEP team.
Thank you. That's helpful.
Yeah, I would just reiterate that by saying when you're shifting a service delivery model and you are presumably doing it to one that is better and still meets the student needs, you will not remove a current service until the better service is in place, which I guess is just another way of saying what Nicole said, but I would just reiterate, and we are in a current state of school districts unable to find people to provide current services right now. So it's a very precarious place to be in. The other cost driver that I think is relevant, it's very relevant. It's particularly relevant for certain districts who do not operate schools. Private or independent schools who serve students with disabilities still bill on a fee-for-service model. So they bill a district for the entire cost, and they define the cost because it's the cost to them. Of what they are providing. So for example, if it is a student with a reading disability and they are providing a reading service, they will send a bill to the LEA. The LEA still only receives their money in the census-based grant. They do not get any additional funding for that student. And so they are at the mercy of the bill that they receive from independent schools. Independent schools are not required to comply with the same kind of implementation of MTSS. They certainly would be privy to anything that the agency provided in terms of support, but they are not held accountable in the same way. And there is an extraordinary cost provision that remains in our special ed funding model, but those are extraordinary costs for a single student. And typically, because of where the threshold is, that is for a student with complex or significant needs who's usually either being served in a therapeutic placement or has a very high level of one-to-one behavior intervention or kind of an array of services. Little bits of service increase in independent schools spread across 10 students who receive literacy intervention. Each of those students is never going to hit the threshold. So you're never really going to be protected by that extraordinary cost. So districts are paying out, receiving far less, and that's amplified pretty significantly for non-operating districts. So I'm going to pause. There's lots of other intricacies we could talk about, and I'm sure if the committee generated questions, we could make sure I can make sure that we get them to you. But those are the most significant and relevant pieces, at least in my mind.
I'm going to ask what feels like Nicole's question inside my own mind at this point. Do you see any short-term solutions to any of the cost drivers related to special education?
I think short term.
Is that your question? I mean, I can own that. Sorry, go ahead.
I think that school districts need to continue to receive support in how they deliver services and make those systems change. School change does not happen overnight. And we're operating in an extreme, I would say, extreme situation around staffing in special ed. Even if the staffing challenges elsewhere in the education infrastructure are leveling out a little bit, they're not leveling out as quickly in special ed. This issue kind of touches and has lots of ripples. Special educators, we have a large number of special educators operating on provisional licenses. So it's just not a context for us to be able to move change forward really quickly on the delivery side. And until the delivery side changes, we aren't going to be able to break out of the way we deliver it. And for someone who spent most of my career in special education, all of us want to move toward better service delivery models. So don't take what I'm saying as resistance. I don't think school districts are resistant to changing their models, but you can't change it until you have something solid to change it to. That was a long no.
I mean, yeah, I love the summary at the end.
So we did have a short-term recommendation on the JAM board, I believe. That was something along the lines of what you were alluding to, Megan, in terms of no cost containment on the independent school side. And so, in terms of pricing structures for these services, there's no downward pressure, and schools that pay tuition just have to pay the tuition. So is that I know there's been some concern about, therapeutic schools being able to, closing suddenly, right? So I think, again, there's like, you push on one side, expenses often need to get paid somewhere, right? And so I'm wondering what observations you have about the cost pressures on these small therapeutic schools. And whether that is a viable short-term, essentially leveling the playing field in terms of the downward pressure on costs for both the public and the privates.
Yeah, so I appreciate that. And I should have, one other qualifier related to independent school, frankly, would be to adjust this idea that, and now at the moment when I say independent school, I'm not even talking about therapeutic schools. I'm talking about general ed therapeutic schools. There could be a change in how that billing occurs. That could be a short-term fix that would at least allow LEAs to have some ability to negotiate, discuss the bill that they receive because they're not receiving any more. I also recall, but the census-based funding advisory group never received this, but I believe the agency had been charged with working on common contract. That's not exactly what it was, but essentially a way for districts to say, yeah, you're charging me for special ed services and it's within the realm of what the agency has determined. And I'm not sure that was ever produced. So there were some attempts at cost containment from that end. So my hard no, I do think there's some mechanics that could be significant, and they'd be especially significant for non-operating districts. The second part that Nicole is talking about in terms of therapeutic schools, the advisory group heard quite actively from therapeutic school providers. Part of the challenge is the level of scrutiny that the agency does not have by law on how independent schools fund themselves, what their budgets look like. I don't think there's resistance on the part of therapeutic schools. I think if there is increased ability to say, here's, open the books a little bit on independent schools, here's how we spend our money, the cost that a district is paying for a high quality therapeutic school may be justified or it may not. We don't really know the answer to that question. And I'm not sure the concern around, well, they'll all shut down if we ask them to peer into their books. I'm not sure that that's true for therapeutic schools. Yeah. I'm not sure the group, the advisory group, I'm not sure that's where they received the most concern. So there could be some things done to say, when we are finding placements for our neediest students, are those costs justified?
Like there's no standard billing tables at this
Correct.
point. It's just very much whatever their cost model is, that's what.
I think it would be helpful if maybe at the next meeting, the agency could provide an overview just of the special education delivery to provide more context. So a couple of things that I think are interesting to put into mind as we're thinking about this is when we look at the types of diagnoses for IEPs, we have some of the largest rates of students identified with emotional disturbances. Mm-hmm. We also tend to have more students that are placed in a school than comparable states in terms of size, which is, the most exclusionary. So that's something to consider as we think about our overall delivery. Also, as we look at the changes in the law, I think it's important to point out that there was a formula change for the extraordinary special education costs, which allows for a higher reimbursement for those services as well. So as we're thinking and teasing out all of the costs, that's another variable that we are analyzing. As it relates to the LEA's oversight of the independent schools, I know that is going to be a topic of conversation for the state board, likely at their November meeting, to really for us to be able to provide some more detail around that. But the LEAs are allowed to negotiate that rate with the independent schools. I'll allow Emily to expand on that just to provide at least a simple framing of what that is currently. If Emily, you can expand on that.
Before you jump in, Emily, sorry. And I will let you answer that part. I did want to go back to the kind of I want to be careful of how I describe this. The fact that Vermont has a higher than the national average identification of kids, particularly with emotional disturbance, that's existed for a long time, long before Act 176. And in Vermont, the way that students become eligible for community-based services is often connected to their disability identification from school. That is different from many other states. And so that's an important bit of context to understand. The question of whether or not we serve a needier population is it may be that we need to identify students in that particular area for them to receive community-based services. And so those are just sometimes when we hear, well, we can't possibly reduce costs because we have so many of these students. I think we have to look at that with a slightly broader lens. I'll let Emily respond to what districts are allowed to do with independent schools. I would also just offer you could bring a parade of special ed administrators from non-operating districts who will tell you how successful those negotiations are. So regardless of whether or not it is allowed, whether or not they have been successful is a very different question.
There are structural issues.
Totally. So yeah, I can speak more authoritatively to what is on the books as far as our statutes and our rules, which I don't mean to contradict Megan's description of experience under those regulations, right? But it's nice to frame both. So when you talk about the payments for special education services to an independent school, it is really important to know if you are talking about a student who attends an independent school because their district doesn't operate, or if you're talking about a student that, regardless of their district operating a school or not, is placed through the IEP team process in a private school as their least restrictive environment. So different rules for the finances of both. When we're talking about the therapeutic schools, we're talking about those placements and student attendance regardless of the district operating a school for that grade or not, right? So therapeutic schools. Therapeutic schools charge tuition rates that are set by the Agency of Education. We're given authority in statute and state board rule to tell us how to set those rates. And we're not given, this is just my characterization, a lot of strong authority to set those rates. The statute sets out a framework that is essentially the agencies looking at the services provided and ensuring that the rate only includes services that are provided to students. But it doesn't speak to the amount that those costs should be capped at or not, or how the agency should judge the dollar amount for those services. State Board rule goes into a little more detail about the process, but does not give the agency, as I said, a lot of discretion or authority to say a particular rate is too high or too low compared to what we're seeing across the state. It really is the agency's job in current law to look at what the therapeutic school says it needs and to judge whether that package that will be a rate only encompasses services to students. That's kind of the way we can be a referee in rate setting. In a totally different sphere, right, for the non-operating districts, these are students of all abilities. So students need varying levels of support to attend that general education environment. The statutes tell us to that a school district, the sending district, and the independent school serving the student have to come to an agreement for each student about what the independent school will charge for any excess costs, any services that are not included in the general curriculum is another way to put that. So the expectation in the statute is, as we said, Megan, that those will be negotiated. And again, Megan spoke to the experience, which I've seen as well, is that whether it's a true negotiation that you might imagine might not be taking place because maybe there aren't a lot of options on both sides, or maybe there's not a lot of information on both sides. But that's, again, in statute left to a negotiation between the two parties.
Thanks, Emily. Megan, we just have a moment left. And I know you had You had 3 things or 4 things. I think you went through all 3 or 4 things. I'm actually not sure. I lost track. I don't know if you've lost track of the numbers as well, but I just want to make sure that you've said everything you wanted to say. And this is, again, like, we're going to spend more time on this. This is really just like to spark our takeaways.
Yep. I got through my list. I don't remember how many things I said. Probably more than I said.
Okay. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. And one of the big takeaways for me is that, you know, cost savings related to programs only work if the programs also change, and programs can't change unless there's another option for them. Thank you. We're going to take like we have done a really good job of using the space on the agenda that we have. And so we are now sort of like running on time, which means we have a very packed agenda. So I'm just going to have us take like a 30-second stretch break, but really just 30 seconds. And then Brad is going to join us to talk about excess spending thresholds.
Are we good to eat too?
You can eat whatever you want.
You got 36.
Brad, do you mind?
Can I have half your sandwich? I'm just kidding. I know.
Totally.
I brought my
For you?
I can't do it from my desk. I have to do it.
thing. Great, I'm glad. We have brought Brad James back from retirement with much gratitude to speak to excess spending thresholds, allowable growth rates, difference between the two, what we've done historically about it, whatever else you want to.
Well, I
discuss with us.
didn't prepare a lot. When we were talking about allowable growth, that's thinking, oh, that was the Wayback Machine. I had to stop and think about that one. And it turns out it came from Act 46 of 2015, which did all the consolidation. And I was sitting there reading it and thinking, did I do this? And then, oh, yes, I did. Okay. It was like, I didn't remember it at that point. But basically, excess spending came in play as Abby said in Act 68, 2003, and it was first implemented in 2005 when Act 68 was implemented. And basically what it was, I do remember those conversations. Basically what it was is that people thought the cost of spending was going up too fast. They want to put some type of governance control on it. And essentially what it did is it came up with a threshold figure. And I don't remember what the initial one was, how it worked. But it came up with a threshold figure that if your spending per pupil was over that threshold period, you're essentially double taxed on the amount over it. And what the legislature did was they realized, well, some costs are uncontrollable, like you have to build buildings sometimes, you have to do reconstruction, et cetera. And so there were some exclusions that were put into place. So what happened was we would look at what spending per pupil was, less those exclusions, compare that to the threshold. And then if you were over the threshold, that got back to your original spending per pupil. So you were double taxing that piece that was over after the exclusions. Okay, that's basically it in a nutshell. And that worked. It pretty much, I would say probably over the years that I did this, so that was 2005, and I stopped in 2024 and gave it to Nicole. Probably on average, most years are probably about 7 to 10 districts that exceeded the expenditure. Sometimes there were more, sometimes there were less. Probably on average, that's about what it was on average. And it was effective in that people didn't want to go over, even though it didn't cost them a lot of tax money, another penny on their rate or something. That was quite controversial for the public, saying you don't have to exceed that. So it was something that people really paid attention to. There were some districts that would historically go right up to the edge. There are other districts that were historically over. And then there were some that were just kind of bouncing back for it. Usually with smaller districts, not always, but usually with smaller districts are going over just kind of in general. So that went along for a while. It changed. It became indexed against a specific year worth of spending, and then it started getting inflated. There was inflation thrown in there, so it would grow. The allowable growth came in when Act 46 happened again. So that was 2015 when Act 46 was written. And that's when that piece was put in. It was for the 2 school years, FY 17 and 18. And it was going to be for 2 years. And it was really, that's when Act 46 was really being implemented. So people were thinking, well, that's a way of kind of controlling the cost. And what they did was they went to the allowable growth idea. And instead of saying that, here's your threshold, what they did is they made it more an individual district thing. And they did that by taking, how do they do the allowable growth? They took the highest spending per pupil from the prior year and divide it by whatever district you're talking about. So you got some number 1 point something, subtracted 1, and you got some fraction, and you multiply 5.5%, and that was your allowable growth. That got added to your education spending per pupil for this current year. And if you were over, then you were over.
I'm trying to visualize a graph based on the math you just did out loud, like the algebra-ish thing.
Yeah, you know what I mean?
And what I'm imagining, I'm just wondering if I'm getting this right, is that essentially the lowest spending districts have a slightly higher threshold of growth than the highest spending districts, but all have some. Okay.
Except for the top one.
It's not.
It's spending per
budget
pupil.
growth.
It's spending per pupil, right? And so, and again, it was an equalized pupil at that point, yes. And again, it was after the exclusions were taken out. Those are the numbers we were looking at. But yes,
But each district had its own target as opposed to a statewide threshold.
Yes, and so as Emily said, the lower spending districts had more room than did the higher spending districts, and the highest spending district that's where they were. They anything over that they got penalized. So
and how'd that go?
Yeah,
How'd that go, Brad?
I think I was.
Why don't we have it anymore?
Again. It worked to a degree. It actually changed before it was implemented. It was supposed to be 2 years. No, it wasn't quite repealed. It was there were 2 years of it. They backed it down to 1 year. So it happened in 2017.
And it happened?
And it happened for 1 year. There were 18 districts that exceeded their threshold. I think I took a quick look. I think the largest one, most of them were small, like $100 per pupil. One was like $700 or $800. And there was a $200 or $300 one per pupil. So there were some that were up.
And what happened when they exceeded it?
Well, they got double tax on that amount that was over.
And this is one of my great questions about how all of this works in Vermont. When districts hit either the excess spending threshold or the allowable growth threshold and they got double taxed, did you get the sense that the majority of taxpayers in that district had any idea why their taxes were the rate they were?
I would occasionally hear from some of them.
I mean, someone has to be pretty active in order to find you.
Yeah,
right?
Well, no. But I mean, usually it was heard, business manager heard it, Elizabeth, probably, you may have heard it, but superintendents heard it. And so if word would filter back to me, and sometimes I would get calls from the public to explain it, to talk about it and such. Was it widely known? My impression was in some districts, yes, it was. Not all by any means. Some districts pay more attention than others do. But in those districts where they're really paying attention, people knew. And as I said, there was always pressure on the boards not to exceed that in a lot of those districts.
My sense was that it was as you said, a number that boards paid close attention to because
the boards did pay.
Would not want to have to explain.
Right.
Because part of the budget information you have to share. So how you get that information in terms of the excess spending and exclusions is the budget spreadsheet that gets submitted to you by business officers. That also, at least in our report, I think in many reports, gets published as part of the annual report. So
it's
you
required.
can sort of, so it's a transparency. Voters do have access to that information.
Right. Now, whether they look at it or not, it's
I
another
don't
question.
know. But I do think it was but I am interested in this idea of who it affected, because my sense is that it does generally impact the small the smaller districts who have less flexibility in terms of the ed spending for equalized pupil, particularly before we had the sparsity and rurality.
Right, if you put all that stuff aside for the time being, because we've been on hold, it's been on hold. FY20 was the last year, did I think?
Sounds about right.
Something around then, yes.
Yeah, and then I think it's coming back next year. So it tended to be the smaller schools. I remember, I think it was for your committee, that I did something where I looked like 10 years of who it hit and had kind of a graph, which means it's there somewhere, Nicole. We can look for it. And a lot, most of them were small. Not all, but most of them were smaller districts. They weren't necessarily the tiniest ones, but there were some smaller districts.
Right.
And again, all that changed subsequently after Act 46 when we started merging,
Right.
But there were still people who exceeded the threshold.
Right. And I think just in terms of the trajectory of overall spending growth, it may have impact on district by district decision making, particularly smaller districts who are more, vulnerable to exceeding, but it hasn't necessarily.
It hasn't. No, I don't think it has.
There are many large districts who spend
Right.
well below the excess.
That's right. And they
hit on the ed fund is a lot bigger than the hit on the ed fund for a tiny little district.
Their budget up by $5 million and when
That's
things
right.
come anywhere close.
That's right.
Spending threshold.
So
But it
spending for
impacted
equalized
the state.
pupil, it tends to insulate the largest districts from any downward pressure on spending.
Unless they're close to it.
So the fact that there was only 1 year of allowable growth, but a continuation of excess spending, do you have a sense of why that happened?
I think the 2 years, and I don't remember the conversations. I'm sure I was involved with them, so I knew how to do it. But I think the conversation probably had to do with the fact that they wanted to give people a little bit of room in terms of the merge that were going to happen, because they were starting in 2017. Is when they really started. That's when Act 46 kicked in, and the first years they thought it was going to when most people grew. And that in Act 17 or Act 46 also had those tax incentives where your tax rate was just along with other incentives too. But those are the big ones, the big drivers. And I think it was just to get people to that point to where they were comfortable with what was going on because they weren't sure what was going to happen when they merged. Again, I don't really remember the conversations, but that would be what I seem to remember. I don't recall why it was switched. It was switched the following year. It was Act 46 that put it in. It was Act 65 because I looked that up. That switched it to a 1 year allowable growth, and they added another 0.9% once you.
Yeah, I think they did make changes to it such that it impacted far fewer.
Yeah, I think so too. Yeah. And I don't know if that was on numbers I put out previously or what. I don't recall, because I was surprised. How did I do this? And I found it. Oh, that's how I did it.
Yeah.
Well, I think that's a really interesting part of this process is like acknowledging the reality of the legislative process. And like, even with very best intentions, there's only so much political pressure that each legislator can withstand. And so if we're setting in place a 5-year timeline, all evidence points us to the fact that that timeline will have carve-outs added to it, right? And we saw that, in the presentation from Abby and Emily, we're hearing about that now. It's just like, I think that's part of the reality of what we need to account for as we're figuring out what next steps
Well,
look
it
like.
is, because the exclusions that were allowed when it first came in, were there maybe five of them, possibly 6. I think there were another 4 or 5 that got put in over time because there was pressure. Somebody put them in. So again, as Abby said, these things change constantly. So.
Well, and the runway matters, right? So Act 46 was 2015. By the time it passed, we were into the FY 2016. Those budgets had been done. So it was literally that fall where districts were putting together the FY 17 budget, that these new targets or whatever, and the levers available to folks to respond to that are pretty limited without doing, again, if you're in a smaller district in particular, where you have potentially you're right up against, you don't have a lot of room to cut without pretty devastating impacts on it, right? And so I think that's where the timing of this stuff has worked at odds, because there hasn't been an adequate recognition of the runway that's needed
absolutely
to respond to some of these.
Because we're always acting out of extreme political urgency.
Sure.
Yeah.
The budget
anything-
process is already done.
Anything else from you, Brett, or anything anyone else wants to add?
I think, yeah, I mean, it works, but it doesn't impact everybody the same way. You know, and as Nicole said, the larger districts tend to be, I won't say exempt, that's not true, but they don't tend to hit it. And
It's not as meaningful, I would say.
Yeah,
That's-
that's a better way of putting it. It tends to impact the smaller districts more.
Thank you very much. Really appreciate you coming in.
Good to
Good to
see
have
you.
you.
Thanks,
Really
Brett.
nice.
Miss you guys, please.
Come back anytime you want, Brad. I'm sure there's
Public building, yeah.
there are some openings even.
I think one thing I would reflect on just at this point in the meeting is that as we're looking at these short-term cost containment strategies, right? There are certain things that work and mechanisms that could be put in place. And as we're thinking about the longer-term strategy, it's both funding and structural reform, right? And I think being clear on that is important.
Agreed. Okay, next we are going to talk about community schools. So this, just a little bit of contact. Hi, Johannes. So I think from my perspective in adding this to the agenda, there's sort of two pieces of this that are very fiscally related. There are like dozens of reasons, maybe hundreds of reasons why this kind of thing is great for kids and families and communities. And that's probably a conversation for another day. Fiscally, there's an opportunity for federal funds here and perhaps even more federal funds in the future. And the other thing is that I think we all know that and have talked a lot about how like one of the big cost drivers is that we're switching human services responsibility from the Agency of Human Services and to some degree from community agencies onto the schools, whether that's like, you know, adding washing machines or something much more comprehensive than that. Districts are doing it in like a district by district, school by school, haphazard way. Community schools could serve as a model for doing it as well as possible, right? Acknowledging that like this is the reality, why don't we try to make it as efficient and effective as possible? So, sorry to you and Johannes and the team.
Yeah, so Johannes can walk through the presentation, but just to kind of set the expectation, this presentation can go an hour, it can go 10 minutes, right? So there's, I think just helping us understand the level of time you'd like devoted to this presentation would be helpful. And he'll walk through some of the programmatic and the design of community schools, along with some of the sustainability considerations as we move forward and think intentionally around how to braid different funding sources. So
We have
what's
like
the time?
10 minutes.
So 10 minutes. So does that help you, Johannes, to 10 minutes?
I will do my very best.
Thank you so much.
First, good morning. Thank you for inviting me to present. I'm always happy to talk up community schools. I am sharing the slide deck in Teams. Is that coming through on your end?
Yes, it is.
Splendid. This is a presentation we delivered to the State Board of Education not too long ago. So it is maybe not a perfect match for what it is you're looking for, but hopefully this will give you some of the important context. My name is Johannes Hench. I'm in the Student Pathways Division at the Agency of Education. This presentation was developed in partnership with Bernice Garnett, who unfortunately could not be here today. She's a professor at the University of Vermont who is helping us with some of the implementation research on this. A quick rundown of what's included in this presentation. There is kind of a snapshot synopsis of what community schools are generally, what they are in Vermont specifically. There is a run through of what the Act 67 implementation looked like. There is some reflections on the current crop of Act 67 community school awardees. And then there's some forward-looking information as far as sustainability and next steps. So that's what we're going to be running through very quickly. So what community schools are? Community school is a model of doing school that leverages the unique central location, sometimes geographically central, but always kind of organizationally central location of public schools in communities, especially in our rural communities. For many towns in Vermont, their public school is their single greatest expense. It is the largest building in town. It is the one space in town that every family in that community is connected to in some way. The goal is not to put everything onto the school and have the schools take the place of service providers. The goal is to leverage that centrality to serve as a sort of interstitial space, excuse me, a connective tissue that allows these connections between resources and needs to be met. In the national models, community schools do this by adhering to 4 pillars: integrated student supports, expanded and enriched time and learning opportunities, active family and community engagement, and collaborative leadership practices. Vermont, because we have to be Vermont, added a 5th pillar, which was safe, inclusive, and equitable learning environments. So that's sort of the framework of community schools. Our Act 67 cohort is represented by these 5 supervisory unions. Within our initial cohort, we had an elementary school, a middle school, a high school, a K-12 school, and a multi-school SU implementation. So we had sort of a full range of the various structures that exist within Vermont. This is a really lovely video where some of the people doing this work are speaking directly and with tremendous pathos and passion about the work they're doing. I am unfortunately going to excise it for time. If you would like to go back and watch it at a later date, I do strongly recommend it. It's about 5 minutes. It brings a tear to the eye. This is to speak about sort of a unique structure that we're using in Vermont to do this work, very much modeling at the national level what community schools do at the community level. You know, community schools are all about leveraging connections to bring assets and needs together. This is at the state level, working on a connection between the individual schools who are the recipients of this grant, the Agency of Education, which is the overseeing body of the grant, and the University of Vermont, which is a research partner implementing this grant. We are not asking anybody to do the work of anyone else. You know, we're not asking the schools to research themselves. We're not asking the university to monitor the grant, but we are bringing everyone's unique skills, resources, and perspectives together to hopefully produce something that is greater than the sum of its parts. And what we're producing is all kind of falling under this umbrella title of the Catamount Community Schools Collaborative. And what that sort of looks like in practice is both research. The Catamount Community Schools Collaborative did publish in the academic journal Learning Policy, or Education Policy, I apologize, an academic journal report on our first year of implementation. We are also doing really direct support to the grantees. We have built up a cohort community of practice, regular connections and touch points, building interpersonal relationships, modeling that collaborative leadership practice. This diagram here is an example of a logic model, which is a tool to help organize inputs, outputs, and goals across a large system level program. This is something that our university research team made for each of our individual implementation sites to help them kind of focus and refine their goals. This is talking a little bit more to the research and the implementation science. These questions up here are the 3 specific research questions that our university partners are looking into for us. And this is what they're kind of studying to help us find some commonalities and some specifics that might help us generalize this implementation. Community schools is a model that is broadly replicable, but its real impact is on its ability to respond to specific community needs, which I think is spoken to by this timeline across the bottom. This isn't an off-the-shelf model that we can just airlift into a community. This is something that takes time to build. One of our community school sites, it took nearly their first full year of implementation for them to hire a community school coordinator, that dedicated staff position who is building those relationships and making those connections. In other sites, it took 8 months for them to have the community of stakeholders coming together regularly and feeling this sort of mutual sense of ownership and trust. It is a time-consuming process, but the end result is a system that has broad mutual buy-in and support, and it's able to address concerns with significantly greater efficacy than if it were just this thing that was dropped into everyone's lap from on high. This next couple of slides, I think I'm going to go through fairly quickly. It's
You could
some
even like 1 word per slide would work.
Beautiful.
So sorry.
No, that's quite all right. This is deeper learning, enriched
Example.
education. This is an example of health and wellness initiatives. This is an example of community resilience and connection, especially with some of the flooding that happened recently. Our community schools were able to step in and support in a big way in their community. This slide is demonstrating some of the ways that this community school funding was a force multiplier for our schools accessing and pursuing other agency and state initiatives and priorities. Socially significant outcomes. This is one that I wish our university partners were here to speak to. This is really their bailiwick. This is some of the exciting results that they're seeing and trends they're noticing. This is expansion and scalability. I would particularly highlight, given our context here, this point right here. Within our 5 awardees, we were able to take this $3 million ESSER appropriation, and that created the sort of space and opportunity for our awardees to apply for an additional $2.375 million in other grant funds that then they were able to pull into their communities. We are working on a contract right now with a group called Apex Consulting that has done research, return on investment evaluations of other states' community school implementation. The general research we're seeing finds somewhere between $7 and $15 returned for every dollar spent. So we don't have the exact data for what Vermont looks like. That's based on other states, but we are very hopeful that we will have that ideally within the next year. And then this is sort of next steps and future commitment. Last year, the legislature appropriated $1 million to continue the work of Act 67. At this point, small-scale sustainability grants have already gone out to sort of dovetail with the end of the ARP ESSER funding for our existing community schools. We are also working on a foundations grant to bring in a new cohort of community schools. At the same time, and the Catamount Community Schools Collaborative end of things, our UVM partners have received a one-time allocation from our federal congressional delegation to support this work. So we are working closely between the agency and the university to sort of marry our efforts so that we're not creating 2 parallel kind of structures. I think that is the thumbnail version of this presentation. I apologize. I believe I have gone over that 10-minute request.
I apologize that I gave you a 10-minute request. So I really am trying to do it. Today, we're really, like I said, we're sampling things, but this is sort of a piece of the puzzle that I think maybe not everyone is aware of. So wanted to flag it. And the agency is doing a lot of work to continue to grow it.
And we can share the whole presentation too.
Yeah.
I think for this to result not in a school, again, mission creep, and be like, we are doing all these things. It really relies on community partners who can come in and use the existing facility and develop, a relationship with the district that the coordinator can. And I just don't know. I think that's what I'm interested in. Is like, how are we guarding against mission creep?
Mhm.
And we have to do all these things because our community is telling us we need it, but there are no providers to do it. And so we'll do it.
And so on the flip side of
And
that,
you
yeah,
draw down funds
Yeah.
to the extent it is a service that we could, again, if the decision is the mission expands, that there's a dedicated funding source.
and what I hear from districts, anecdotally, is that they want to do these things, they feel called to do these things, and they, for whatever reason, can't access the community partners. And when I talk to the community partners, they feel that it is an impenetrable fortress to get into the school and start collaborating. I've spent a lot of time in my school building collaborating. I don't actually understand, but it's like there is a systemic disconnect in sort of the ways of doing business between the two groups.
If-
And so it seems like a really great model for that.
If I could just add in, speaking
Yeah.
to that subject of building those relationships, defining the mission, and kind of right sizing partnerships is going to be a focus of our report that we're going to be submitting in December. That is certainly something that there was lengthy conversation with all of our awardees, and that was a major topic of the implementation research that we were doing over the course of this project. So that is certainly a concern that we are sensitive to.
Thanks. We're going to move on to the next agenda item. And if folks want to spend more time on this at a future meeting, let me know. Board of Cooperative Education Services.
Hi there.
Stephanie, hi.
there you
So
go.
nice to see you. Hi,
Good,
Jill.
thank you. I was trying to see if Jill, her camera was able to come on. There we go. Okay, sorry. All right, so I am going to introduce myself. I'm Stephanie Beatty Hancock. I'm the Director of Student Services for Wyndham Central Supervisor Union, and I'm also the board president of the Vermont Learning Collaborative. And Jill and I are very thankful for the opportunity to present to you guys today about our Board of Cooperative Ed Services hopes. That's where we're headed. So I'm gonna, Jill, are you in charge of the PowerPoint or somebody else? Not sure. Whoever's in charge, if you can
I
go to
think
the
Jill's
next.
doing it.
Okay,
I
next
think
slide.
she's not muted, but I also can't hear her, Jill.
Jill, we can't hear you if you're saying things. I
Okay.
see your face that you know that, but you're trying to solve the problem. Right. Okay. Stephanie, I think you're going to have to do the talking until Jill solves the problem.
Okay, I just want to be able to like see Jill's face, so I'm like reading cues, but I don't know if I'm going to be able to. The joys of online, right?
Oh,
Hear me now?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Excellent. Okay, and can we see the presentation?
We
Yes.
can.
Excellent. Okay.
So Jill, you can go to the second slide, please. Okay. So this is our current board of directors. We have representatives from 8 different supervisor unions in school districts. And I'm going to let you guys take a quick look at that. You probably don't want me to read everybody's name, but we're all the way from Wyndham Southwest all the way up to Two Rivers, Mountain Views, Windsor Northeast. And I wanted to introduce you to Jill Graham, who is our executive director. So Jill, we're on slide 3 now, sorry. There
Yes,
you go.
so good afternoon, everyone. I had the pleasure of joining this incredibly dedicated group in August, and they have had a very strong vision and a commitment to the regional services model for quite some time. I bring with me to the group over 20 years experience working in the collaborative model in Massachusetts and building specialized programs as well as offering assessments and services and professional development to districts. So that is my background.
All right, so our presentation agenda is to give you a little bit about the Vermont Learning Collaborative history, our vision, the challenges we've encountered, reasons why we're pursuing heading toward BOCES, which is a Board of Cooperative Educational Services, the steps we're taking toward BOCES, what is needed, and then we figured we'd field questions for you if that works.
Thank you.
Welcome. Okay, so here's the history in a few bullet points, but essentially Vermont Learning Collaborative was already in existence as an existing nonprofit. They were providing a lot of supervised unions and districts with professional development, fiscal agent work since 2014. Around 7 years ago, 2 of our area superintendents were invited to become part of that board with the intention to shift as they were retiring out, and the superintendents were talking about regional organization for, especially for substantially separate programming for special education. That regional superintendent group then discussed that with directors of special education. We all discussed, how we could provide efficient services and supports for students in the least restrictive environment. And that kind of led us into exploration of regional collaboration, thinking about services, programming, and then kind of like even beyond that. So the biggest thing I want to emphasize is that 8 supervised unions and school districts provided a substantial amount of seed money to begin these next steps for us. So it just demonstrates we were putting the money where the mouth was, right? We were all very much invested in this, and we still are. We then contracted with New Solutions K-12, who's operated by Nate Levinson, who used to work for District Management Group, so he's very familiar with Vermont landscape. And he helped us, or they helped us, hire our first executive director, and that was Kim Oliveira. And now we are on to Jill, who's helping us, continue our pathway. So again, we have 8 board members, an executive director, a very part-time administrative assistant, and then we have contracted employees. All right, next slide, Jill, thank you. So we have revamped the Vermont Learning Collaborative, as I was saying, to work toward providing regional, effective, and efficient support around challenges such as hard to fill positions, coordinating placement in either existing district-run substantially separate programs that have capacity, or in creating programming for different supervised unions and school districts, providing cost-effective and timely evaluations and services, developing and managing school-based collaborative run programs for high needs, low incidences, for disability, and high quality professional development. We always attach that and more because we're always evolving and responding to what the supervised unions and school districts need. And what I would like to say is just, this is a very typical Vermont creative grassroots initiative. So we're all learning through this entire process, but we have the common vision that we are all really duplicating efforts. And we really would like to make that more streamlined and efficient. Moving on to the challenges, we have had some limitations as a nonprofit. So there is, a limit to the number of independent schools in Vermont. So we're not able to create our separate schools right now. It requires flexibility in thinking, commitment to using different agency services. As you saw from the different supervised unions, we're a very large geographical area. There's lack of facility space options, so we have to work really hard to find classroom space opportunities that are already in district buildings. There's limited funding of sources, or funding sources, sorry. Recruiting highly qualified staff is difficult. And then we're competing with well-established specialty agencies. So despite having access to many already established resources, supervisor unions and school districts are still struggling with the capacity to meet all of these ever-changing needs. So that is the tough part. Now we want to move on to the solutions that we're working toward.
Which really brings us to why the consideration of BOCES, or a service agency model, because it provides the opportunity to provide shared resources and responsive solutions that can meet those needs regionally in a cost-effective manner. And some of those include, and Stephanie mentioned them, reducing the duplication of efforts and staffing, working to be able to provide optimal sized programs that are cost effective, that are in geographically accessible locations, and ultimately being able to improve educational outcomes for students, which is what this group is about, by increasing students' connections, their social opportunities, and their access to meaningful educational opportunities. So all of this wraps up with cost-effective solutions because we can consider scalability and economies of scale when we're providing this programming. Excuse me. So specifically, what ABOCES can provide, but it's certainly not limited to, is again that regional efficiency with staffing resources that are able to be shared, high quality professional development that is shared amongst the member supervisory unions, BOCES programs, BOCES services, being able to help meet that need for high quality, substantially separate special education programming that is geographically accessible and cost effective. We can help support those short-term gaps in staffing, and we can also provide the consultation services that ultimately help to build the capacity of the member districts, whether that be through consultation or managing projects for them. And then, of course, being able to pool the collective resources of the member supervisory unions, whether that be for cooperative purchasing or transportation or other needs. As Stephanie indicated, this group has been incredibly committed and really had a long-term vision of regional services in the southeast area of Vermont. So since the onboarding of the executive director position, the collaborative has really been able to take further steps to realize the goal of becoming an educational service agency. With the passing of H630 this past spring, that reality is even closer. So this summer, the members of the Vermont Learning Collaborative actually took the opportunity to go and visit a substantially separate collaborative model in Massachusetts. And they will be doing that again, actually in November, to look at what does that model look like when it is actually within district programs. So collaborative classrooms, but located within district buildings. That is another model that we will be looking at. This fall, the board has been working very diligently on draft articles of agreement. They have established mission, vision, and goals. And we have projects underway for consultation within the district to help build that capacity. So what I would like to offer to this group, if anyone is interested in joining us for tours in Massachusetts, you're welcome to reach out to me to be able to see what those collaborative models look like, both within a substantially separate setting, as well as those that are housed within general education districts. And our contact information is at the end of this slide. So the southeast area of the state has really had a head start towards the envisioning and the moving towards regionalized services. So when we talk about what is needed, we are, I think, ahead of the game in many ways, but we anticipate that we will have articles of agreement, governance, and supervisory union approval for ABOCES no later than the end of this year. And that is really far ahead of the timeline that is outlined in H630. So I think for us, it's the readiness to receive the BOCES model and to have some established guidelines for the development of that urgently needed cost-effective programming. Now, ultimately, once in existence, ABOCES should and will be, over time, self-sustaining through tuition and service revenue. But as an initial startup agency, funding is absolutely needed to be able to support the requirements of establishing an educational service agency. I'm very eager to make that transformation.
I understand why it might cost more at startup. Once it's running, I sort of clearly see the path to like why this could improve educational outcomes. I'm curious about opportunities for reducing overall statewide spending?
Sure. So I can speak to my experience previously, and that is any of the programs, any of the services that are being offered through an educational service agency absolutely should be competitive and should allow your supervisory unions and your districts a cost savings versus what they would potentially be spending if those students were attending a private or independent school, or if they had to contract outside of the auspices for private services. So we as educational service agencies need to make sure that what we are providing is cost effective and competitive, so that statewide you're seeing reductions in those special education costs.
So this is being primarily viewed as an alternative to out-of-district placement.
It is one of the opportunities for services that a BOCES model can provide. It can provide much more than that, but the history behind educational service agencies has varied. A lot of it is specialized special education programming. Some of it is cooperative purchasing. Some of it is professional development. If you look at the Massachusetts model, for example, of those 24 educational service agencies, not all of them actually have specialized programming. Some of them do high quality professional development. Others do cooperative purchasing, but many of them do specialized programming, and many of them also offer transportation. So there's multiple opportunities for the BOCES model.
And in New York, where it's actually just called BOCES, without a special other acronym, all the tech ed goes through BOCES.
Just from a governance perspective,
I have big
like,
questions
how
about
are we not adding another layer of decision-making bureaucracy,
right,
and inefficiency into it already pretty.
So I think that's a big question, right? As we're thinking about how to roll this out and support it and provide some clear guidelines on kind of effective implementation. But one question would be, a lot of the services described you could provide within a larger district, as opposed to adding another layer. So I do think that needs to be part of the conversation.
Jill and Stephanie, do you have thoughts on that? If you're providing community services, how you're sort of accountable to the public, and then alternatively, you like sort of becoming another administrative layer in a system that already has some administration?
I can speak a little bit to that. What I would say is that it's kind of creating a hive mind within several supervisor unions and school districts. So I think it would be more like a career tech ed kind of programming. It would be like a separate kind of location that we would all be feeding students into, so that students could get the least restrictive environment, but also have their needs met. I like the idea of community schools as well. So I think there could be some dovetailing with agencies and other supports. And I think it would be a great move toward just considering regionally just how we can be more efficient as a group. Instead of creating the same thing in each supervisor union, we would be creating one really great kind of program together. And it could be a few different programs, but that's just kind of my thoughts. Jill, do you have anything you want to add?
Yeah, when we look at duplication of efforts, right? So even in a large supervisory union, I'll take, for example, the locations within the Southeast region. So Brattleboro is one of our current member district towns. Certainly lots of opportunity and capacity within that district. However, they border smaller regions such as Wyndham Central. If those districts were to merge together, it may be that within the BOCES model, Brattleboro might be able to house a very specific program that could be regionally beneficial to more than one district. And maybe Wyndham Central is able to house a program or services that is regionally beneficial to that area without, again, duplicating those efforts amongst the larger districts.
Thanks. Thank you. very much for joining us today. We really appreciate the, I personally really appreciate you being so responsive to jumping on with short notice. And also really appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for the time. We appreciate it.
We're going to skip school construction and we'll get an update at another time. It's an ongoing conversation. It's not a surprise to Jill, who's sitting awkwardly behind me. She's looming. So next steps, folks.
So you're coming to the meeting on Monday?
Yeah, and I'm really looking forward to it.
And the idea, the request is for us to update the commission on the work we've done so far.
And so what I'm imagining I'll be saying, and would love other input from you all, is I'm going to talk through basically like the list from the brainstorm and what we hope to do with that. I'm going to talk about the testimony we received thus far. I'm going to publicly reprimand the very short timeline we were given and say that it was an impossible timeline. And then talk about this, like the challenge of the short-term cost containment and the long-term systems change where real cost savings are, and say we're meeting every 2 weeks. We're committed to working through it. We have some, it's hard to do it in a timeline that makes for adequate analysis because work takes time and so does thought. What else should I add in there?
Who are you reprimanding?
You all.
Well, the legislature gave us a December 15th
Took
deadline.
some time to set up this subcommittee, though. You all were meeting for a little while before you made the subcommittee.
what you're saying.
Yeah, I think just one more month would have actually made a difference. And then you decided October rather than December. There's some timelines in there. Could have been lengthened a little bit.
And then, the whole commission's gonna have to hear it all over again anyway, because they've got to approve.
Well, and I think the interest was in getting information out to the field. I mean, budgets are being built right now. So if they're to avoid the people show up in January and they have an idea to impact a budget that's baked, it's just the cycle of nonsense continues.
To show up in January and they are going to have ideas and there's nothing we can do about it.
And it's helpful if people are rowing in the same direction when everyone comes with ideas.
It'd be helpful to speak with the same voice about do no harm.
Would the committee be interested in a presentation from our consultant around how Vermont's education system compares to other states across the country?
I think that'd be great for our
2
next
weeks?
meeting.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Other things I was thinking about for in 2 weeks was I mentioned the PICUS report. He can come give us a presentation along with the report, and you all will get the report when it comes out. Does that sound helpful?
Yes.
Okay.
That would be a good.
Is that for next Monday also? For the
That would
whole
be
commission or for the next
2 weeks.
Okay.
2 weeks. So thinking about us in the national context is sort of the theme of what we'll do in the next 2 weeks with a few different agenda items related to that. Anything from today that people want to dive more? I want to dive more deeply into everything we talked about today. Are there things that feel should we wait until after we're done with was there anything from today that feels like we need to dive into immediately because there was a short-term solution buried in there?
I'm interested in the whatever changes that were made to the excess spending. That is going to be in effect for the budgets that people are working on, and whether we have any sense of how many districts that might impact based on last year's budget. Ed spending, I'm assuming it's still ed spending per pupil. Are there recommended tweaks to that might make at least what's the state of play for excess spending? That is current law.
That will impact budgets coming year.
Yes, that was, I think, the goal of it.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else from anyone?
I think healthcare and special ed are important pieces, but I think they're post December 15th.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I just want to, if we ever want to turn any curves, we have to start turning the curve, even if we're not going to see an immediate change from that action. So if the legislature wants to make a difference in 4 years, that's something that needs to be started this year. We're going to need to start it this year. And so we can't not discuss solutions that are going to take a long time. We have to discuss those too. And they usually take more deliberation.
We will be meeting during the session.
Yeah, that's going to be so great.
Monday.
Yes. Yeah.
That will provide us with feedback, and we probably need, once we know who the chairs of education are, I know we'll at least have a new one. In the Senate, to start that loop. So, because we're both on money committees and we don't have anything to do with educational policy.
Nothing.
Okay. Pay for it.
The other thing I think is important for us to wrap our heads around is just in general costs of staffing and staffing levels. So I think you called that out in some of your reports. That is something that could be affected in the FY26 budget process. That's that the number of people districts employ, that's a decision within their control. And I think it might be useful for us to understand what the current state is, a little bit more targeted conversation around.
Not just statewide.
Not statewide, but sort of regionally, and how that may or may not connect to districts impacted by excess spending. I mean, we need to start to tease out like where are the real cost drivers and how are the policy mechanisms that we currently have in place.
And in some places, the school construction plays a part in that too. So I think having Jill present a little bit more about construction at the next meeting would be helpful.
So Jill and Ashlyn will both be invited to the next
got the
meeting.
report, but what I haven't heard is, do we have the money to think about funding?
Well, there's a second study committee that's meeting right now.
working group in
A
place.
working group. Yes, who's trying to figure that out.
That's probably the one pot of money that the state might have to bring to the table to help. school. I mean, I know we got a lot of leaky roofs. I just wish my husband was still working to sell them.
Anything?
Clarify question so we can target the presentation. So what would you all like to hear from Ashlyn and I? Because Ashlyn, like I'm on the construction working group. You also have Rep. Brady and Senator Gulick. Ashlyn presented on bonding models, but that would be sort of what role she would have there. So what would you all like to learn? Do you want to see where we're going, where we think we're heading on
We'd
that
like to
working
know
group?
where you're heading on the working group, and we'd like to hear from how far you've gotten on sort of bonding models and where space you see for that.
Okay.
So I know there's decisions to be made about how a fund would be funded.
Yeah.
And then there's decisions about how funding would be prioritized if there was funding. And I think we'd like status updates on both.
Okay, I'm going to make a suggestion. I think that Ashlyn would be important for the bonding part, but also maybe somebody from JFO to talk about how you pay for the bond, which is a revenue stream that needs to be established. And that's, I think, the crux of what the working group is working on, but that's more on the legislative side of things.
Okay.
So that'd be a suggestion. Just so you get more bang for your buck.
Thanks. Okay. Anything else? Gonna move, we adjourn. We now adjourn. Thanks. Thank you, everyone. That was a lot.
Thank you. That was.
Yes.